irresolvable. Ladies and gentlemen, irresolvable. This reflects the faith in journalism. Germany's post-war success story is also a success story. In our view, we the peoples, particularly refers to however, we the peoples also means that the Security Council itself must become more representative and inclusive. The world's population has more than tripled since 1945. the negotiated two-state solution is obsolete. They want us to think it is now merely a term used in diplomacy and can no longer be achieved. But whatever way you twist it, there will only be lasting peace if people can lead self-determined lives in security and dignity on both sides of the 1967 lines. Precisely for this reason, it remains important to work on a negotiated two-state solution 25 years after Oslo. The conflict in Ukraine will also continue to occupy us. Along with France, Russia, and Ukraine, we are working hard to implement the Minsk agreements. The focus is on the measures agreed a long time ago with a view to stabilizing the ceasefire. All efforts, including our discussion on a possible UN mission in eastern Ukraine, are aimed at achieving that. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget that acute crisis management is at best a step towards peace. Lasting peace can only be achieved if we put a stop to the arms race. This is not some sort of nostalgic rhetoric from the days of the Cold War, whose balance of terror seems utterly benign compared with the scenario of a multipolar arms race with far more unpredictable players. In the case of North Korea, the Security Council's united stance and the sanctions helped to pave the way back to dialogue. That was important. However, North Korea must follow up its words with deeds, and this must lead to complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. Germany is prepared to contribute its know-how, including the expertise we gained during the difficult negotiations with Iran. The nuclear agreement with Iran may not be perfect, but so far it has prevented Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and averted an escalation that 3 years ago was highly likely. That is not insignificant. We Europeans therefore stand together by the agreement. We're working on keeping economic exchange with Iran possible, and we called on Iran to continue to fully implement its commitments. The fact that we stand by the JCPOA does not mean that we're turning a blind eye to Iran's destructive role in the region or to its ballistic missile program. That said, if there were no agreement, this would not make the search for solutions in Yemen any easier. On the contrary, disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation must generally become more of the focus of the work once again. We share Secretary General Guterres' view on this. Our common rules must keep pace with technological developments. Otherwise, what currently sounds like science fiction may very soon become deadly reality. Autonomous weapon systems or killer robots that kill without any human control. I ask you, please support, both here in New York and in Geneva, our initiative to ban fully autonomous weapons before it is too late. And, ladies and gentlemen, not only in this domain is prevention the right answer. The United Nations of the 21st century must tackle the root causes of conflict. These include climate change, action based solely on nationalism with the objective of putting my country first reaches its limits here, not least because our climate knows no borders. The alarm bells have rarely sounded as loudly as they did in the summer of 2018 in almost all parts of the world. Germany and the European Union stand by the Paris Climate Agreement. Moreover, we want to ensure that the Security Council makes the devastating effects that climate change can have on the security and stability of entire countries and regions an even greater priority. We also need a quantum leap as regards post-conflict peace building. That is why Germany will contribute at least 25 million euros to the peace building fund this year. Over the last 3 years, Germany has tripled its contributions towards promoting stabilization and preventing crises around the world. Take, for example, Iraq, where the terrorists of Islamic states have, for the most part, been militarily defeated. Instead of leaving the Iraqi authorities to fend for themselves, we are training security forces that foster administrative structures, and we're providing civil support so as to promote stabilization, reconciliation, and inclusive reconstruction in the country. Only when military measures are embedded in a clear political strategy will peacekeepers truly bring peace. This is also the objective of Secretary General Guterres' peacekeeping reform efforts. It would be a mistake to limit our discussion to bartering over decimal points and scales for assessed contributions. Of course, efficiency is important also for us Europeans as the largest funding contributor. However, discussing potential cost savings alone does not do justice to the benefits that peacekeeping missions bring. For example, in countries such as Mali or Lebanon, which have held peaceful elections and enjoyed relative stability, in part thanks to the Blue Helmets and the political efforts of the United Nations. We Germans will continue to contribute militarily, financially, and always also politically, through diplomatic efforts and by investing in stability and reconstruction. After all, the success of UN hinges on member states' political backing. This is particularly true for Libya right now. To tackle the Herculean task of advancing functioning state structures, the United Nations needs our political support. Ladies and gentlemen, peace is more than guns falling silent. Only just societies will remain peaceful in the long term. Societies in which men and women enjoy equal rights and in which women participate in all social decision-making. This is not only a matter of fairness and respect, it is simply about humanity and reason. Kofi Annan put it this way: we will not enjoy development without security, or security without development. We will not enjoy either without universal respect for human rights. 70 years after the creation of human rights and personal freedom remains merely a distant promise for many. In the Security Council, in the Human Rights Council, or here at the General Assembly, we will demand accountability when human rights are trampled underfoot, whether this concerns human trafficking in Africa or attacks on the Rohingya in Myanmar. Nowhere. Even in war, there are limits. Those to account those who willfully attack humanitarian aid workers, hospitals, or schools. Anyone who violates the most basic rules of human civilization must be punished. That also applies to those who use chemical weapons, thereby breaking a taboo that was respected for decades. This is why it is so important that the OPCW has meanwhile been authorized to find and identify those responsible. The perpetrators must be fully aware that their crimes against humanity, never, not anywhere. In this regard, the International Criminal Court remains indispensable because it sends a clear message to the victims and the perpetrators of the most serious crimes that justice will prevail. Ladies and gentlemen, earlier I spoke about how we Germans in particular have faith when it comes to multilateralism. This faith is also based on the fact that the United Nations, time and again, and despite all disagreements, delivers proof of what we can achieve through joint efforts. I'm thinking of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which remains our guiding principle for making this a better world for all people. I'm also thinking about the successful conclusion of the negotiations on the Global Compact for Migration and Refugees. The fact that more than 190 member states, countries of origin, transit, and destination reached an agreement on such complex and controversial multilateralism. It is a success achieved by truly united nations. The United Nations is built on our courage to reach compromises. The organization grows without desire to shape things. It thrives on our common pledge of together first. Common ground is created when we put people at the heart of what we do. The desire for peace and security and the dream of a prosperous and dignified life are things that all people can relate to, whether they live in Berlin or Bamako. The United
Ministers of I now give the floor to His Excellency Kemais Shinawi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Tunisia. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ibrahim Abdul Karim Al Jafari, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Iraq.
In the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. August Assembly, I would like to begin by conveying to you my warmest greetings, and I convey those greetings in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate, and the same God who, according to the Quran, is the sustainer of man on earth. To Her Excellency Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Royal Highnesses, Your Majesties, Your Excellencies, may the peace of Allah be with you. President, it is my pleasure at the outset of this statement to congratulate you personally upon your election to the presidency of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. I wish you every success in the discharge of your duties in that role. I would like also to express my gratitude to Professor Miroslav, who so very ably and wisely steered the work of the preceding session, the 72nd. 4 years ago, and from this very same podium, I shared with you an overview of the situation in a country where Daesh had and burned the land in its wake. It had killed, it had pulled down the mausoleums of the prophets and other artifacts of culture. It had expelled 6 million Iraqis from the provinces that it had taken over. It preyed upon minorities. It ravaged women. It expelled Turkmens. It killed men. It killed Shiite Turkmen women from the regions it seized. It burned some of them alive. This could have been a historic catastrophe from which we would never have recovered. Despair had seized the hearts and minds of many. But there were still plenty of us of Iraqis who were full of faith in God, who had full faith in the determination of our young people, of our women, of our leaders, to turn things around. We had full faith in all Iraqis, of all faiths, of all ethnicities, and that faith was duly repaid because they rose up to defend their country. Blood was shed on the field of battle to liberate the territory of Iraq, and a huge sacrifice was paid for that liberation. The fight left thousands of martyrs and amongst our armed forces and left scores more injured. And not just the members of our armed forces, but also those from the People's Mobilization Units and from the police, from the many clans and tribes who also answered the call to battle against Daesh. And so we were able to stand on the field of honor victorious, thanks to the support of the United Nations, the international coalition, and indeed the support of our brothers and neighbors from the international community writ large. And so our full gratitude to you. Iraq will never forget all those who stood shoulder to shoulder with them at this bloody and dark hour. This was a key battleground, a deadly battleground at the time when the world itself was under threat, at a time when terrorism had spread to occupy the largest swathe of territory in history. There were fighters in Iraq from some 120 nationalities fighting in the cause of terrorism. But thanks be to God and to the international community, we were able to vanquish this ferocious enemy and to drive it out of Iraq. It is now breathing its last in its last stronghold in Syria, before being snuffed out. And now, here, 4 years later, I would like to share with you how my country is facing the future, a future of reconstruction, leaving war behind it. What my country is doing to allow displaced persons to return, those displaced persons who were driven out of their homes and scattered to the various corners of the world. We are working hard to strengthen state institutions. And so we're on the dawn of a new chapter in Iraq, joining the club of democratic nations. We are strengthening levels of participation in governance and ensuring that we're building a political and constitutional consensus. We are bringing together persons of all religious and confessional belief around a national effort based on the respect of the law and of the Constitution. Most recently, we held legislative elections as part of a cycle of democratic elections that have occurred since 2004. And with each round of elections, we learn more and further embed our democracy. We have a new prime minister who's been appointed by the president, who has been charged with setting up a cabinet and to leading the government for the current mandate, with a chief focus on building prosperity in the nation and stamping out once and for all terrorism. As I'm delivering this speech to you, the people in Kurdistan are preparing for democratic parliamentary elections in line with the multi-party federal system that we have chosen to adopt as our democracy framework in Iraq. I would invite the international community to shoulder its responsibilities borne to Iraq and to make available to Iraq the pledges and monies that were promised to us during the Kuwait conference to disperse said funds. Many pledges were made in Kuwait to support Iraq. And these pledges were made because Iraq is the cradle of civilization and is also a crossroads and a melting pot of different nationalities, religious beliefs, and traditions. We are a motherlode of wealth of many kinds that needs to be exploited and harnessed properly. This is a new era in Iraq's story. And this is also true when it comes to our fight against terrorism. We engage in an all-out campaign against the remaining pockets of terrorism to make sure that their ugly faces are no longer seen in our country. We have also an economic, cultural and political strategic plan in place, because this is not just about stamping out terrorism, but ensuring that we build a robust society that can withstand any scourge or spectre of the return of terrorism. As part of that, we are focusing on young people and women. We are rolling out programs to improve the plight and well-being of young people and women, to improve their living standards, to put an end to levels of unemployment, and to improve their skills base. And this is all part of our efforts under the 2030 agenda. We're also doing all that we can to protect diversity and to maintain peace and security in the recently liberated regions of the country. All of this is part of national reconciliation, which is a huge undertaking, which must also lead into the strengthening of our national institutions. Attempts are being made to ensure that Iraq is held together, and I think that the recent combat and fighting that we saw has only served to strengthen Iraq as a single unique geographical entity and to bring its people closer together as they stood together to protect their country. They have withstood terrorism and they are pursuing democracy following the election guidelines that were set for us, meeting those deadlines. We're promoting diversity and we're promoting political plurality, particularly in the run-up to upcoming elections. The United Nations has been a strong partner of Iraq, particularly in the guise of UNAMI. United Nations staff have made huge and much appreciated sacrifices. UNAMI has most recently been working to support activities of the Iraqi government as it pursues the aforementioned goals. I would like to underscore the key role played by the Special Envoy, Mr. Jan Kubic, who has made considerable progress and headway during the time of his mandate. So we thank him as he prepares to leave, and we welcome Ms. Janine Hennes Plengsh.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to see you all again. I see a lot of familiar faces. I wanted to say right away that when we were preparing for this trip to the UNGA, many of you were asking about separate interviews, but due to my schedule, it was not possible. So I hope that we today will try to satisfy your interests of all those who wanted to have a conversation with me. So hello once again. Let's move on to the questions right away.
Back to the United Nations, and on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, we are delighted that you take time to come and talk to the press as you always do. My name is Sherman Bryce-Pease, South African Broadcasting. I have a national question of national interest to South Africa. Is Russia disappointed by the new administration of Cyril Ramaphosa declining to move ahead on the nuclear deal with Rosatom? That was something that President Putin raised at the BRICS summit earlier this year in Johannesburg. Can you give us Russia's position on that deal? And also there's been some reports that Russia is trying to lure thousands or hundreds, if not thousands, of disgruntled farmers over the land question. The land debate is a very big topic of expropriation, and there's a big debate in South Africa. Are you trying to lure some of those farmers to Russia?
I didn't understand something about the farmers. What was that?
So there's a new policy now of land expropriation in South Africa that they are implementing. It's a parliamentary process. People could lose their farms without compensation, and there's talk that Russia is trying to take the gap, if you will, and lure those disgruntled farmers.
No. We're busy. Now, this time, we are busy with meddling with Catalonia elections. No time for this, you know. It's too far. But wait. As for the nuclear power station, actually, any deal depends on the readiness of both sides to agree on the format of the deal, availability of resources, and so on. If the government of South Africa, and this, by the way, rethinking started before the current president became president, if the government of South Africa found out, as it was looking into the project, that it needs some more time and some more analysis of the situation, it's their sovereign right, and we always respect the right of our partners.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. Can I ask you a question about Syria and about the important deal that Russia did with Turkey? There is a question in that deal which is to the fighters from the group that used to call themselves al-Nusra. So can you explain to us how they are going to leave, and if they don't leave, who's going to force them to leave and where they're going to go?
I will respond in Russian. The agreement about the de-escalation zone in Idlib, which stipulates the creation of so-called a belt, a demilitarized belt of 15-20 kilometers depth. It was achieved by Turkish and Russian presidents. It was endorsed by the Syrian government. It was also endorsed by Iran as the third participant of Astana format. 2 days ago, we met with Foreign Minister of Iran and Turkey. We stated this disagreement. Am I bothering you? Am I bothering you? They stated that this agreement has taken hold. Fighters are being transported out of this demilitarized belt, as well as heavy weapons. Yes, indeed, there is a question. What's going to happen next? And next, Turkey, as you probably know, if you have read the memorandum signed in Sochi, has taken upon itself an obligation to separate the opposition, which is prepared to take part in the political process, from Jabhat al-Nusra. This is not a simple task. The U.S., who has promised it us many times during Obama administration and later with the current administration, they could not do it. And we truly hope that Turkey will be able to do that, to separate normal, adequate, patriotic opposition from Jabhat al-Nusra. You know it very well. This is a terrorist organization. It has been listed as such by the UN Security Council. There is no place for al-Nusra in such a position. There is a lot of speculation how the issue of these fighters is going to be solved, and there is talk that they will be sent off to other hotspots, for example, for Afghanistan. This is unacceptable, and these terrorists have to be eliminated, or they have to be investigated, and later there'll be a judicial verdict. You know, well, no one is saying that the Sochi agreement has crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, and still there are many questions, but still it brings us closer to the final solution of the problem. But the thing that we have one time for civilians and for alleviating the direct threat to the Syrian army, to the Russian military base, that's a fact. Because this demilitarized zone, that was the place where there were strikes conducted from, strikes against the Syrian army and our military base. We are going to act as thorough and thought through as possible, as cautious as possible. We'll be thinking how to minimize risks for the civilians. And I would like to guarantee to you that what happened in Raqqa, for example, Iraqi Mosul, where these cities was liberated by the anti-terrorist coalition led by the U.S., will not allow for that to happen. We did not allow that to happen in Aleppo, in eastern Ghouta. Hundreds of thousands of people are returning to these settlements and provinces who have left them during the hostilities. Raqqa recently was visited by a representative of some mass media, I don't remember which, and they reported that people are trying to get back there, but it is hard to do that because still there are bodies unburied lying there. And everything, there are a lot of landmines around. So this is also an issue that has to be solved. Let's not forget that in Syria there are also other territories which require attention of the international community. And I mean the zone which was created unilaterally by the US in the south around the Al-Tanfa city, 55 kilometers of radius, and inside there is a refugee camp, Rukban. There are terrible conditions there. And this circle that the US has created around Al-Tanf, this is a refuge for terrorists. It is well known. Right now we're conducting negotiations with the US for this illegal presence to be put an end to. And the UN is also taking efforts to move people out of this refugee camp because the conditions there are so inhumane. I believe that we're going to pay attention to all issues on the Syrian territory. As for Idlib, of course, we're going to tell our colleagues from mass media what will be our next steps.
Здравствуйте, Сергей Викторович.
Mr. Lavrov, Ilya Petrenko, RT channel. On the 30th of September, that will be a third-year anniversary of beginning of the Russian military operation in Syria. I believe that that's a good anniversary to draw conclusions on the ground and in political sense. So we'd like you to do that. A question. I wanted to go back to what was said by Mr. Trump during his press conference. He was thanking Russia and Syria and for a long time for what, as he said, that operation of taking Idlib was stopped. And later he said, let them come in, let them get rid of the terrorists, but let them do that selectively. Do you understand that as a certain signal? How do you think his own diplomats are going to treat that? Well, I don't know how these or other things is perceived by the governments of other countries, so I will not comment on that. But naturally, as I responded to the previous question, terrorists have to be eliminated, or they have to be there has to be a judicial process. There are methods that the military has, and as well as special operations forces. They have a special counter-terrorism tactics of how to fight them in the cities and in town. Indeed, professionals have to study these issues. But it is a principled position that it is impossible, it is unacceptable to have a hotbed of terrorism in Syria. Now, there is a common view on that. As for political promises for the future, throughout these 3 years that Russian airspace forces have been there, and military police as well, they are present in Syria upon the invitation of the Syrian Arab Republic. I would like to highlight several main achievements. First and foremost, elimination of terrorist hotbeds in the south, in Coms, in eastern Ghouta as well. Second, the issues of humanitarian aid to the civilians are being solved more actively. And third, that's political creation of Astana 3.0, and they have taken upon themselves the initiative in lieu of UN being passed, and that promotes political initiatives. And the apex of that work on the previous stage was Sochi Congress for Syrian National Dialogue. It took place in January this year. They endorsed a declaration. And for the first time, on behalf of the government and the opposition, they highlighted that all Syrians are prepared to work based on 12 principles worded by Staffan de Mistura. Before Sochi Congress, it was impossible to gain the support both of opposition and the government on those principles. The same declaration makes a decision to create a constitutional committee where the Syrians themselves are going to define the future and the constitutional architecture of their country. Right now, this constitutional committee is being formed. And the first delegates were actually sent by the president Bashar al-Assad. The opposition required a few months to draft their lists, and right now we're talking about topping up that list by the representatives of the civil society. What's important here is not to make haste. Sorry, this is maybe not an official expression, but to be very thorough about the part of the committee which will be represented by the civil society. That has to be accepted. These people have to be acceptable both for opposition and for the government. Unfortunately, a small group, this is 4 Western countries and 3 Arab countries, they have adopted a declaration which requires immediate beginning of work of the Constitutional Committee. We know that the pressure is being applied to Staffan de Mistura, in this regard. He's forced to declare that he's creating a committee by his own will and with such a composition. That will be a grave mistake. So this is aimed at undermining all of what was done throughout Astana process, and to again bring it to the fact that not the Syrians are going to solve, to decide what kind of country they're going to live in, but for the architecture agreed upon by the foreign powers to be imposed once again on this long-suffering country. We see that many times. I will not list the countries, but almost any conflict that we see right now in the Middle East or the Near East, that can be an example of such a situation where external powers are putting their vision on paper. The vision, how the people are going to live in that or other country. And there is not a single time when such attempts brought fruit for stability and normalization of the situation in that or other country. So we're going to insist, so that will be no haste. We cannot protract it forever, of course, but it's a matter of quality of the Constitutional Committee and not a certain artificially drafted list. We don't see such artificial timelines for any conflict. So here we have to follow the principle of helping Syrians and not dictating them what to do.
Thank you, Minister Lavrov. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. A question on Iran. Russia has said that it will do everything it can to save the JCPOA. Would that include setting up a barter system for Iranian oil? And are Russia and China considering an alternative payment system with Iran to bypass the US dollar? And a quick question on North Korea. Ambassador Haley accused Russia of wanting to ease sanctions on North Korea so that Russia can ultimately connect a Trans-Siberian railway into North Korea and to South Korea. What's your response to that?
Well, my response to that is very simple. Both Koreas want that. So if there are sincere words coming from our U.S. colleagues saying that they want for the North Korea and for South Korea to prosper, then there should be no problems with the proposals that we have made, and which actually has been on the table between us, Seoul, and Pyongyang for a long time. This is in the interests of developing infrastructure in the Northeast Asia, and in the interest of everyone who who provides trade between Asia and Europe. That will be the most efficient and the shortest of transit routes. Now, Iran, yeah. On the 6th of July, there has been a meeting of ministers of foreign affairs of the EU3, Iran, China, Russia, and Federica Mogherini. At that meeting, the European members of the deal spearheaded an initiative to create a certain consultative mechanism which will review the matters of how to continue to ensure economic benefits which Iran is obligated to receive according to the deal which was achieved in 2015, and how to do that so that the outside participants would not influence this mechanism. There will be measures in financial and in banking spheres. We have met again in the same format on Monday. That was the 24th of September. And the Europeans have confirmed again that they're doing work. Our experts are also taking part in that. And I see quite a good outlook, quite good possibilities. Well, only if our European colleagues are not going to reference that their companies do not want to work in Iran and so nothing can happen. That would be a great mistake. And I hope that we will all not only look at the business and saying that, well, if the business does not want, then what can we do? We hear such expressions right now already, and some of the European companies are leaving Iran. But there are places are taken by others, and the Europeans understand that it's easy to lose the market, and returning back there would be very hard. Now, there is no politics behind that, but it's just the commitment to what was agreed upon. In our country, it's considered a matter of honor, especially if the thing is put on paper and endorsed by the UN Security Council. As for using currencies in transactions, now not to be dependent on dollar, this idea has been in place for a long time, and we're doing that with China and other countries. And those countries were also partners directly with each other. I mean, third countries. It's a natural thing, actually. Right now, I think there is an expression, and I was talking about that, as our Western friends do not want to mention international law, but they're saying rules-based order. One of the backbones, one of pillars of such rules was the dollar system, which was safeguarded by the US. As soon as the US started to abuse the position of dollar in the international monetary system, naturally all countries who worry about their future started to look for ways to avoid such dependence. This process is taking place, and it's going to weaken US influence on global economy.
System for oil.
As I said, according to the proposal of our European colleagues, all avenues, all ways are being discussed for the Iran to receive what was promised by the UN Security Council.
Minister Lavrov, my name is Ali Barada. I'm with the Sharq al-Awsat newspaper and France 24. My question is that this morning your counterpart Pompeo met with the GCC foreign ministers plus the foreign ministers of Jordan and Egypt, and they agreed on a coalition, strategic coalition for the Middle East to stabilize Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and to stop the malign activities from Iran. Where do you stand regarding this strategic coalition, and how do you evaluate your Russia's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries? Thank you.
We have very good relations with Saudi Arabia, as well as the Council of the Council of Cooperation of Arab Countries of the Persian Gulf, and with each country in that council we have advanced political dialogue, good relations in trade, economy. With a number of countries we have military and technical cooperation in advanced stage, and we are developing it. We cherish these relations. Besides bilateral relations with these countries, we also have mechanism of ministerial meetings of Russia plus Gulf countries, and from time to time we meet in Russia or in one of the countries in the region. This is a very useful mechanism for dialogue and exchanging of opinions on regional matters. As for the Middle East strategic alliance, as far as I understand, MISA, I don't remember the name. We hear that this alliance is being prepared. I know that there was a meeting at the level of ministers today in the morning. However, as far as I understand, saying that everything has been decided and it's being created, well, that was not announced. It was planned to do at the summit, which was going to take place in Washington in October. It was postponed to the beginning of next year, so let's not make hasty decisions here, conclusions. Now, saying that the world opinion and in the region there is being created such an idea, well, you have mentioned stabilizing Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and to contain Iran. So it seems that in order to stabilize all these countries, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, you have to achieve for the Iranian positions to be weakened, and even better, to be eliminated. So there will be no Iranian influence there. How possible is that? Well, I cannot judge on that. Not a single country with such history, with such population and civilizational values as Iran, I don't think that you can lock it in a cage within its borders. Saudi Arabia also has its legitimate interests, and it is implementing their interests beyond their borders, and such a small country as Qatar is also influencing the situation and processes in other parts of the region, which is actually being criticized partially by its neighbors. So hoping that you can lock Iranians within their own borders, and that would be a real policy, I don't think that that's realistic. The idea is, the way out is actually for the contradictions and differences long-standing, which are being more pronounced right now, are to be discussed and to overcome. Now, talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran, saying that there is a tension between UAE and Iran and Egypt and Iran. So I believe that at a certain stage, it will be necessary for all stakeholders to sit down at the negotiations table. And when and if, I'm saying if, the like-minded countries are being gathered also according to criteria of their negative attitude towards Iran, I don't think that's not going to add any stability to the region. And you have to have a conference with Iran, and we're promoting that actually. We have a concept of promoting security in the Persian Gulf, including Persian Gulf countries, the League of Arabs, Iran, Organization for Islamic Cooperation, UN, European Union, US, Russia. So basically, that was the conference on cooperation and security in Europe. First steps as transparency, military sphere, confidence-building measures, inviting each other for visits. We're going to come to that in the end. I believe that no one seriously wants to solve problems in the region through yet another unpredictable idea.
Raghida Dargham. Mr. Minister, you just said something which is pretty controversial, because you want Iran to be an expansionist country in the region, because you're saying you cannot be realistic in expecting them to stay within their own borders. Why would you support such expansionism, and particularly the United States, as you know, during this session?
That's how fake news is born.
But this is what you just said. You just said
no.
Iran can't.
I said you cannot limit Iran, its own borders, and prevent Iran to exert influence outside its borders. Like Saudi Arabia exerts its influence, like Qatar exerts its influence. That's what I said.
Okay, you just said, use the word cage. This is why it was an interesting use of words. Anyway, your explanation, of course, is more important than my point. Let me ask you, sir.
Well, I thought eloquence was one of the journalistic methods, I tried to be eloquent. I'm sorry, I failed.
Yeah, well,
but don't misinterpret me, Ragida, please.
No, I will not misinterpret you, Mr. Lavrov. Please tell me about the difference in position between you and your Mr. Pompeo on the role of Iran in Syria. If Iran was to stay militarily in Syria, the Americans made very clear they want Iran out, and I don't know what you feel about it. What is your policy? How was the conversation between you? And given your relationship with Israel, and you're talking back and forth with the Israelis, what do you think of what Mr. Netanyahu said in threatening Lebanon in particular, citing 3 positions where Hezbollah has its missiles? Have you been urging them to not attack, or are you worried that they will attack? Thank you.
Well, you have to ask not me, actually, what Russia or the US think about Iranian presence in Syria. You have to ask the legitimate Syrian government, upon whose invitation Iran is helping Syrian government to retain their statehood and to fight terrorism. Now, that Iran is helping to solve counterterrorism goals, I can confirm that. We've never seen a terrorist threat in Iran, including very complicated times in Russia when a terrorist international working there. We've never seen any ties of these terrorists in our countries with Iranians. Actually, incidentally, if we take the US and their attitude, a few months ago, there was an open letter of intelligence veterans and FBI veterans, military intelligence of the US, where they have urged not to create artificial terrorist threat stemming from Iran. And I would like to remind you official statistics, according to which about several dozen of the organizations which are defined by the US government as terrorist, only one is a Shia organization. The rest of them, mentioned there as enemies, have mentioned Iran. We do not have coinciding goals at 100%, and possibly there are much less percentage with Iran and Turkey in the Syrian Arab Republic. Still, at this stage, the fact that we're allies in fighting terrorism and in retaining Syrian statehood, in providing help to Syrians in order to provide conditions to begin the political dialogue, for them to define their own destiny, I do not have any doubt that this is a very useful cooperation within Astana format, which everyone welcomes, actually. Now, Israel, multiple times, and as we said that publicly, has guaranteed that they will retain the deconflicting channel, the same as we have with the US. And this is what we demand from Israel right now. When Israel was expressing concern that Iranian or pro-Iranian groups placed basically on the delineation at the Golan Heights, we have reached an agreement, an understanding, especially since the southern de-escalation zone was freed from terrorists. Iranians went back more than 100 kilometers, as Israelis and the US has asked us. Instead of them, the positions in the Golan Heights at the demarcation line was taken by the Syrian army units. Later, the UN observers returned. Well, actually, the UN forces on observing the demarcation, and right now our military police is helping them. Everything that was expressed by Israel as a concern about their security around Golan Heights, we have alleviated all concerns, and we did what we promised. Unfortunately, our American colleagues, as I have already mentioned, Al-Tanf, have said many times that they're going to eliminate this illegitimate zone. I don't know why it was created, but they did not deliver on their promise.
Thanks, Minister. I would like to know your opinion of the state of multilateralism is in danger. And second, I would like to know your position about the United States sanctions against Venezuela and the dangers of other invasion.
Now, as for state terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism, there is not such a term in the international law or in the UN documents. Yes, the US and other states have introduced this term. Well, you have to understand. You have to understand that either there is proof or there is no proof. We do not have proof that, for example, Iran is a state that sponsors terrorism. I have said that before. About the number of countries their neighbors have suspicions, including the Middle and Near East. I will repeat again. If a certain country is consciously teaching terrorism and sending them to do terrorist attacks in other countries, it is unacceptable. In here, you do not have to use the term state-sponsored terrorism or terrorism. Any terrorism has to be eliminated and to be prevented so that no one would ever do these bloodshed and bad actions. As for Venezuela, yes, I spoke today and I said that any unilateral sanctions are not only illegitimate, but they're also counterproductive, including for those who are introducing sanctions. Achieving result by such methods is hardly possible, especially if we talk about countries that have their self-respect towards their traditions and to their own nation. I'll give you an example. More than 50 years, their unilateral US sanctions against Cuba, they did not bring any result in regard to changing the behavior of Cuban leadership. That was not the case. I believe that the same goes for Venezuela. There is going to be no result. You have to agree there. And it's hard to get an agreement there because the government seems prepared. However, the opposition receives signals from abroad, first and foremost from the US, that they're being supported. So there is no impetus to agree with the government, and even to talk to the government is lacking in Venezuelan opposition, at least in the part of it. And external players, instead of taking someone's part in the internal conflict, have to call the government and the opposition to sitting down and agreeing with each other. I have said that I don't see a different way for any crisis in the region. That's what you have to do. You cannot bet on this or other party.
Валентин Богданов, телеканал «Россия».
Valentin Bogdanov, Russia TV channel. Sorry.
I'm Lily Chen from Hong Kong Phoenix TV. During the high-level meeting this week on DPRK, Foreign Minister from China has suggested that to review the provision of the sanction of the resolution and to modify the sanctions, given on the positive progress on DPRK, how would you? And President Trump has been accusing both Russia and China for interfering the U.S. election. How would you comment on that as well?
Well, what my colleague Wang Yi has said about the need to encourage progress in the negotiations on denuclearization of Korean Peninsula and on alleviating sanctional tension, I have a positive attitude towards that. I have said this basically the same thing as my Chinese colleague at the UN Security Council meeting. I heard President Trump's intervention, but I think this time he blamed China only for interference. He did not mention Russian. Well, he did mention us before. Once again, well, these things have to be presented through facts. We're the last people interested in interfering in interior affairs. If some criminals on our territory, on Chinese territory, on the territory of other countries are doing these things, they have to be tracked down and caught through Interpol and other mechanisms of cooperation of special services and police. Well, if there is just a suspicion, now let's present these suspicions, let's discuss them. We used to have a working group on cybersecurity with the US. The US, during the Obama administration, they have frozen down this cooperation. We suggested to the Americans when they were troubled about our interference in their elections, we suggested to renew the work of this group for the professionals, for the experts, to look at the concerns that can arise between the parties. Well, if we talk about interference on the whole, not into hacking some kind of website, the figures that we see of the number of hacks or ad placement, well, they're just ridiculous. Less than 0.1% of all of the content that is appearing in that or other social media. But if we talk about interference on the whole, well, you know, we have millions of examples of how the US were openly not being shy. They requiring this or other government to take a certain position. When the Ukrainian events were in all news lines, the US Congress has adopted a law where State Departments was tasked, it was mandatory, to spend $20 million annually on promoting democracy in Russia, including support of NGOs, were promoting pluralism in Russia and are opponents to the government. These are not just abstract contemplations. This is a fact. There is such a law in place. And the number of NGOs receiving finance from the US, I can't remember the exact figure, but there are a lot of them. On our behalf, as soon as someone just wants to talk to their counterparts, for example, in favor of carrying guns around, Maria Butina is in jail. She just came over here and she wanted to promote ideas shared by the NRA, National Rifle Association of the US. Now I have even latest examples of interference. The US have appointed Mr. Kurt Walker as a representative on the Ukrainian settlement. He have met several times with our representative Vladislav Surkov. He's promoting ideas that would simply cross out the agreements achieved in Minsk by the heads of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. The agreements of 2015 required agreement of Kiev and the Donbas territories to conduct direct negotiations, to agree on constitutional reform on the special status of that region, about amnesty, about rebuilding economic ties, and conducting elections based on the conditions which would be agreed between the Kievan authorities and the region. Well, right now, Mr. Walker right now is saying that's not the right way. First, we have to introduce to that territory 20, 30,000 of armed military as the UN forces with heavy equipment. Also, we have to dispatch there about 500 or 600 civilians, which would create administration, which is going to disband all existing municipalities and other authorities there, of how crucial for life of the citizens there. And they would define how to do elections later. That's how the US see the implementation of these agreements. Well, it would be okay if Mr. Walker was doing talks about the Ukrainian settlement. He keeps stating that first Russia is to blame for everything. And then he allows himself to say that. Also, I have noted down the quote, Russian nation deserves freedom. That's what the US representative of the Ukraine is saying. And the Ukrainian experience should inspire the Russian nation. So you can draw your own conclusions. Who calls for interference and who doesn't. I'm not even mentioning that all Eastern European countries and Asian countries, African and Latin American countries are being told by the US ambassadors not to talk to Russia, not to trade with them, not to buy gas or oil or military equipment. And right now, when we're actually blamed for interference in the inner affairs in the Balkans, what is happening before the referendum in Macedonia? Personally, the leaders of the government of the EU countries, they're coming out there and saying, you have to make a choice towards NATO EU membership and to change your name as well. And the same urge is voiced by US leadership. Recently, Mr. Mattis, Defense Secretary, was there. Well, if we said even 10% of that, we would already be put to shame. As for High Representative of the EU, in one of her statements at the beginning of the month, she said that the Balkans are a EU territory. So where we are, there is no place for others there. So I think we have to do some outreach work with our colleagues for them to behave, at least outwardly.
Special person, it's Russian news agency ITAR-TASS correspondent Maria Hrenova. 2 days ago here in UN, President Trump a question and was granted with an answer. Please, Maria.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Mr. Lavrov, I will voice my question in Russian because I'm Russian press, In August, MFA said that there was appeal to the UN Secretary General that has to do with the Russian diplomatic property in the US to prepare the report to at this session of the General Assembly. This year, you had a meeting with the Secretary General. What did you talk about? Was there a response to that letter? On the whole, what do you think? Are there any possible actions in the sphere of international law in order to solve the issue with the Russian diplomatic property? Thank you. We did not talk about that because the issue was already solved and the information is put in the report, which is going to be reviewed at this session. This issue was discussed at the Committee for the Host Country Relations, and it is stated there that our position is legitimate. As for further legal actions, we're finalizing making a case in the American court. We have hired lawyers, and we want to start with the US courts. We do understand that this is going to be a complicated path. At the same time, we are prepared for an out-of-court settlement on a mutual basis, if the US, in the end, will consider it possible to return to delivering on their international obligations.
Mr. Lavrov, Benny Avni of the New York Post. The Israelis that visited Moscow regarding that incident over Syria of the downing of the Russian plane, have they changed any minds there? Also, do you think that the Israeli-Russian agreements or understandings that existed before the incident come back? And when will Russia deliver those F-300 and start jamming the skies near Syria?
Well, the delivery started already. And as President Putin said, after that incident, and we gave the picture which our military presented at the press conference in the Ministry of Defense. As the President said, the measures which we will take will be devoted to ensure 100% safety and security of our men in Syria. And we will do this. As I said, the full briefing was presented at the Ministry of Defense, and the President exhaustingly commented upon this in public.
Yes. So this is Amitod Singh from NDTV in India, also a DAG fellow at the UN this year. With your president coming to India in just a few days, I just had two short questions about that. The latest information we're getting is that there could be a possibility that the signing of the defense deals to the tune of $8.5 billion may be put on hold, may not be done when he comes, Mr. Putin. And the second question, in light of the allegations that have come about with France and India's defense deal, it's the biggest controversy in India. Is Russia doing anything to perhaps, be more thorough in the signing of the deal with India, checks and balances, etc.?
I didn't understand. What about France? You mentioned France?
Rafale jet deal for 36 fighter jets, and there's a controversy around that in India that it is a corrupt deal. So I'm just asking, in your deal with India, are you going to be more thorough? Are there any changes in the processes?
I haven't heard that there was some corruption case around that deal about Rafale, right?
That's right.
Is it what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
Well, we participated in the bid for that delivery, and we did not get it. I haven't heard about this since. As for the other deals which are being negotiated, I haven't heard anything about the timing, about postponement, about putting anything on hold. And I understand that India will be taking sovereign decision how to proceed and what kind of weapons India needs.
Телеканал «Россия».
Russia TV channel. Mr. Lavrov, you were talking about the Ukraine, and considering the peacekeepers' idea, the UN are telling us that there is a joint resolution of the Ukraine, US, Germany, and France, and they're uniting their front. At the same time, he's saying that he does not want to share the details of the resolutions. Russia can learn and counter that. Yesterday, you had a meeting with a French foreign minister. He said a month ago that such a step would be premature. Did the position change, or the US and Europe have different opinions considering what you said? Mr. Le Drian, he did not he did not mention Ukraine. As for Poroshenko's statement, I don't want to comment them, because there are Minsk agreements and there are proposals on the UN Security Council's table as a draft resolution introduced by Russia, which envisions sending a mission of the UN to protect the OSCE monitors, because sometimes these monitors face very inconvenient situations and conditions. As for other draft resolutions, we did not see them. You can write anything in your own circle, but before I see this text, I cannot and I want to comment on them. If it what Mr. Volker constantly brings up, that I can only smile to that. I'm amazed at how serious and grown-up people who read Minsk agreements can propose something as that.
Mr. Lavrov, thank you. Stefano Vaccara, Radio Radicale in Rome, La Voce di New York. Two questions. One is about Libya. I ask you this question. Libya? Are you satisfied with the situation in Libya so far? You expected that now we should be in a different situation? And then the second question is the two speeches on Tuesday, President Trump and before Secretary General Guterres. Which one? Russia, what does it like better? What is the vision for the world for Russia? The one closer to the one of President Trump or to the Secretary General Guterres?
No, насчет Ливии.
Well, as for Libya, it's a little strange for me to hear such a question whether Russia is satisfied with the situation in Libya.
I don't think Russia is satisfied, just saying. Are you satisfied in a sense, or you expected that in Libya the situation would be different?
I thought you would be more thinking more about whether Italy is satisfied with the situation in Libya. or France for that matter.
Actually, that's the question.
Well, we are trying to help create conditions for the political process. Frankly speaking, we don't believe that in this case as well, like in the case of Syria, there should be any artificial deadline. We welcomed the meeting which took place between the four leaders of various Libyan parties in Paris in May, I think, was it? And we support the efforts of the special envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Salame. But to say that we must die, but make sure that elections take place in December, I don't think it was sending the right signal. Elections must be held when all key political forces have understanding that this would be something, the result of which they accept. And we still don't see that level of agreement between them.
What did you like better, the Trump speech or Guterres?
No, вы знаете,
Well, you know, President Trump said, by the way, that he firmly promotes sovereignty of each and every country in the world. And I fully support that. Of course. Well, because the US, and they're saying that not only through President Trump, but they're saying that sovereignty is the main thing, and all these multilateral things are secondary. This is what is written down in the US Constitution and in the laws of joining the UN, that their priority is given to the national legislation. But in such an open, violent way, the previous administrations did not drive that point home in such a manner. Still, if the U.S. is so committed to the sovereignty as the founding principle, then probably you should not interfere in the matters of other countries. As for multilateralism, it is a necessary thing today because all issues are becoming trans-border, because technologies are uniting the world, and they give us a chance to have a completely new way to live your life, and giving opportunities for those who want to improve standards of life and to use technologies to the benefit of the people. Also, there are people who would like to abuse these means, including terrorists and extremists and such other criminals.
Thank you, Maria. Mr. Lavrov, you and other people of your government have criticized an alleged rise of fascism in Eastern Europe. Do you see the same thing in Western Europe with the new governments, neo-fascism in Austria or in Italy? Do you see the same tendencies? And secondly, is Russia delivering weapons to Myanmar? And if so, would you think of perhaps using that as pressure for the generals to stop their ethnic cleansing?
As for neo, yes, this is also taking place on the EU territory. There are regular marches in Latvia and Estonia of former SS fighters, and they've been honored. We see the same, and I have mentioned that at today's General Assembly speech. We see demolition of monuments, and this happens mostly in Poland, for example, in those countries which were liberated. There are also other trends in a number of other countries. That's why we annually introduce a draft resolution to the General Assembly about unacceptability of heroization of Nazism. In the EU, they all abstain, because in that they see an attack on the freedom of speech. Well, if the EU believes that an attack against the freedom of speech is the idea of implementing the Nuremberg Tribunal decision, then the EU should get their lawyers and look again at what their obligations are. What was the second question? About Myanmar.
Both. Do you see neo-fascist tendencies?
We're friendly with political parties, which are system political parties. Well, not exactly by being friendly. We do relations with them. They're systemic political parties. They do not have people-hating policies. They do not show fascist symbols as they do in Estonia, Latvia, and the Ukraine. And in that, I do not see any grounds for drawing parallels. As for our arms trades, I cannot have all the figures and statistics in my head. We're selling our arms only according to all international legal norms in this regard. So all norms that regulate arms trades.
Yes, thank you, Foreign Minister Lavrov. We've been hearing increasingly strong rhetoric from Israel and the United States against Iran. Russia is a friend of both Israel and Iran, which, like Russia, are both heavily involved in the Syrian conflict. Is there a way Russia can act as a mediator to promote reconciliation between the two sides?
I have already spoken about that. For many years, we have been promoting concept of creating a system of security around the Persian Gulf. Yes, we do promote for such cooperation to be fostered. Well, not cooperation, at least to start talking. If we are perceived by both parties as a term for them to meet, we'll be only happy.
No. Yes, please.
Mr. Lavrov, thank you so much for coming back here to New York.
Nice seeing you.
All the best to you. I have a question of a different type for you, if you don't mind. Given the political trends dominating the world today and the new development, what do you think of the future of the United Nations?
Я думаю, все-таки
I think that the UN has a future, and this future will probably be not so easy, considering that you have mentioned what we see today. On the one hand, yes, indeed, the US are attacking the multilateralism. They want, as I have said, for their sovereignty to prevail. And probably they mean first and foremost their sovereignty for it to prevail in all international matters. However, I'm convinced that there's an objectively new world order taking shape when the Asia-Pacific, China, India are vibrantly so many resources. Well, the resources are only starting to be used in Africa, the potential of the Latin American continent, on the whole, the Asia-Pacific region. It would be impossible to control all these processes from one center and to dictate to all one single avenue for behavior. All these sanctions and threats, the strive to make the country trade not with everyone but only with themselves, this is all temporary. And in any case, they will have to sit down at the table and agree. And the best place to agree and to find the balance of interests of all key stakeholders, without forgetting other countries as well. That's the UN.
Lebanon Strat, please.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Linka White. I wanted to ask you, what do you think? Is it possible that the US relations with Russia can be better in the nearest future? And the second question, when President Putin wants to come to Washington and to meet with President Trump, well, the relations are bad and probably at their all-time low throughout the time that we have ties with the US. Everyone understands that. The meeting that the president have already had in Hamburg and this year in Helsinki, they were quite constructive. I think everyone has also noticed that. The agreements that we believed were in line with the interests of both countries. They're being perceived positively by now that's my first-hand impression because I took part in the meetings. It is also apparent that those who have to implement these agreements for that or other reason are in no hurry to do that. I mean both the joint work on counterterrorism. We used to have a working group. Right now it is on hold. The same goes to cybersecurity, joint work on that. I also talked about that. This is also a dialogue on strategic stability, including the issues that have to be regulated in order for the agreements in that sphere to function. The SALT agreement, the New START agreement, as well as INF agreement. But beyond that, strategic stability includes much more factors that influence that. The time for the negotiation is ripe, or I would say even overripe, and the dialogue is right in a limbo, and it is not positive for anyone. We used to have 2+2 meetings, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense, together with the US, meetings of the heads of staff, meetings between the teams of the US and Russia at the level of deputy heads of foreign ministries, with intelligence and security agencies. Right now, all that is on hold. However, the dialogue was begun between Secretary for National Defense, Mr. Patrushev, and National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton. They used to meet in Moscow in June, later in Geneva in August. Now they're preparing yet another meeting, and this is at least something that can allow to support the relations, to maintain them, and now to allow them to roll back even lower. The dialogue between the military is of key importance in order to ensure that there would be no happenstances or unpleasant happenstances. You know that in the US, there is a law that the Congress has forbidden Pentagon to cooperate with Russian military. The only exemption is the deconflicting that we're doing in Syria. And he also asked about President Putin has received an invitation from President Trump. President Trump has also a standing invitation to come to Russia. When everyone is prepared, and when we have proposals on the timelines, we can talk about that.
Thank you. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi.
Somebody asked question already from that chair.
That was the president of UNCA. So the question is not for the chair. Mr. Lavrov, I want to ask you about peace in the Middle East. You heard the speech of Mahmoud Abbas and of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Peace in the Middle East is now very unattainable, very far. The Trump administration is trying to dismantle the basic tenets of justice, that including Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees, the illegality of settlement. Now, Mahmoud Abbas is suggesting a new mechanism, which to expand the number of peace brokers or peace mediators to include Russia, China, France, maybe other countries. What do you think? How can the Palestinians believe that the international community did not abandon them? What Russia can do to make peace possible in the Middle East? Thank you very much.
We never abandoned the mechanism which was universally endorsed for mediation, namely the quartet. The quartet envoys met during this week here in New York in the margins of the General Assembly. There were no practical result, but at least they met and conveyed to each other what they think about state of the game now. We are committed to the decisions of the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Arab Peace Initiative. Of course, we see what is going on. As you said, it's an attempt, persistent attempt to dismantle all the basic cornerstones of the potential deal for a two-state solution. And this is a cause of concern. I met yesterday with Mahmoud Abbas. He is very much frustrated, I would say. And whatever the Palestinians believe they should do in these circumstances, we would certainly understand and support. And another thing which is worrisome is the situation in Gaza and the situation between Gaza and Ramallah. We highly appreciate and value and support Egyptian efforts to bring them together, but the latest round of efforts did not bring the results, and this is also worrying because it does not add to the ability of the Palestinian people to present their case more forcefully.
So, Alan Dargan from MTV Lebanon. The Israeli government is running commercial warning travelers not to go to Beirut or via Rafiq Hariri airport because Netanyahu is claiming to attack 3 sites related to Hezbollah holding thousands of missiles transferred by Iran near the airport. Do you think that the Israelis will act on this threat and Hezbollah will respond because he will feel like he has to stick with his slogan that we are also able to fire back.
Well, this would certainly be a gross violation of international law, and we would be very much against such an action. What actually will happen, I cannot predict, but we warn against any violation of the Security Council resolutions, and that even the use of the Lebanese airspace is a violation of resolution of the Security Council.
Minister Lavrov, I have an important question. May I please ask this? You made a comment in the Security Council opposing the weaponization of medical care.
Weaponization?
The weaponization of medical care. Can you comment upon the fact that the humanitarian exemptions to the resolutions against North Korea have been a notorious failure, and the Global Fund to combat AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis has cut off funding to North Korea? This is a form of biological warfare.
I fully agree with you. It's not a biological warfare. It's really, again, violation of the Security Council resolutions which provide for humanitarian exceptions from the sanctions regime. And I said yesterday in the Security Council that we want this to be reviewed, especially in line with the progress which is slowly but is made on the political front. Thank you very much. I really have to run.
Come from different corners of the world. At times, there are competing interests among us. At others, there is even open conflict. And that is exactly why we need the United Nations.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joel Simon. I'm the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. CPJ is an international organization that promotes press freedom around the world and defends the rights of journalists to report the news without fear of reprisal. Over many years, we've engaged with the UN and its agencies and institutions on a number of matters relating to press freedom and the rights of journalists. For example, we met with the last several Secretary Generals to express deep concern about the murders of journalists around the world and the issue of impunity. We've discussed the protection of journalists working in conflict zones. We've been pleased to see an increasing willingness to speak out on these issues, even while we acknowledge that conditions have not changed much for journalists on the ground. But there has been one issue around which it has been difficult to engage with the UN, and that is the unjust imprisonment of journalists around the world. That is because governments are directly responsible for these grave abuses, and the UN has a culture of rarely calling out its members. But the jailing of journalists has reached unprecedented levels. At the end of last year, there were 262 journalists jailed around the world, the highest number ever recorded by CPJ. The jailing of journalists is a brutal form of censorship that is having a profound impact on the flow of information around the world. The time has come to speak out and name names. At the end of last year, Turkey was the world's leading jailer of journalists, with 73 journalists behind bars. China was second with 41, followed by Egypt with 20. Together, these three countries jail 134 journalists, which is more than all the other countries of the world, all the journalists that are in prison in all the other countries of the world. But at today's event, we want to talk not just about the numbers. We want to talk about the journalists themselves. The journalists we will highlight today are reporters who have sacrificed their liberty to keep their communities and the entire world informed. We've selected 5 cases in which we believe sustained international attention can make a difference. The journalists come from Bangladesh, Kyrgyzstan, Egypt, and Myanmar. I want to start with the Reuters reporters Wa Lone and Kwa So-u, who are jailed in Myanmar. These 2 journalists have been sentenced to 7 years in prison on retaliatory for violating Myanmar's colonial-era Official Secrets Act. Working for an international news organization, they have reported on a story of profound global significance. Their unjust imprisonment not only violates their own individual rights, it violates the rights of everyone in this room and around the world. Each of us, under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a foundational UN document, has the right to seek and receive information through any medium and regardless of frontiers. But how can we do so when the people who are informing us are imprisoned for their efforts? As world leaders gather here in New York this week for the UN General Assembly, this issue needs to feature squarely on the agenda. In a moment, Stephen Adler, President and CEO of Reuters, and Amal Clooney, who is representing Wa Lone and Kwa So-u, will say more. But first, let's watch a short video about these 2 brave journalists.
On September 3rd, 2018, a Myanmar judge found 2 Reuters journalists guilty of breaching a state secrets law. Wa Lone and Cha So-u face 7 years in prison. They were arrested after uncovering a mass killing in Myanmar, which the authorities later acknowledged did. In August 2017, a military crackdown began in western Myanmar that has since sent 700,000 Rohingya, a Muslim minority, fleeing to refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh. During the crackdown, 10 Rohingya were killed by security forces and Buddhist villagers. Wa Lone and Cha So-u investigated that massacre. A village elder gave them 3 photos. The first 2 showed 10 Rohingya Muslims and boys kneeling on September 1st, and then the following day. The third showed them in a pit, hacked and shot to death. The reporters verified the story not only with Muslims fleeing Myanmar, but also with Buddhists and members of the security forces. However, before they could publish their report, they were detained during an arranged meeting with police officers. For the next 2 weeks, they disappeared without a trace, leaving Wa Lone's wife, Pan E, desperate for news. The reporters remained in custody for months up to and during their trial. During that time, Pan E gave birth to the couple's first child. Cha So-u has a 3-year-old daughter with his wife, Chit So-win. He's already missed many milestones in her young life.
တမင်းဖြစ်တဲ့သူကလည်းဖေဖေမိမိတိလာတယ်လေဖေဖေကမိမိနဲ့လည်းဘာလို့အတူမနေတာလဲဖေဖေကမိမိတို့တာမီးကိုမရှိလို့လားပြောတော့တမီးလေးကိုအဲ့လိုစိတ်တရမ်းမှကြောက်တဲ့အတွက်ကိုကဘယ်လိုပြောလဲဆိုတော့ဖေဖေကမဟုတ်ဘူးထောင်မှာဝင်နေလုံးနေတာအဲ့ဒီစကားလည်းကိုကဖျားမှာတော်တော်လေးဝမ်းနေခဲ့ပါတယ်ထောင်မှာဝင်နေလုံးနေတာတမီးဖေဖေကဟိုနော်တမီးအယုတ်တွေပါလေဝေဖို့ရဲ့တမီးရဲ့ကြောင်းတေးစရဲ့ရဲ့အဲ့လိုမျိုးပေါ့ညားလာပေါ့မိရောက်နေတယ်
After their arrest, Wallon and Chasa'u were put in black hoods and taken to a secret camp where they were interrogated, threatened, and denied sleep for 3 days. After 2 weeks, they were transferred to Myanmar's notorious insane prison. Nonetheless, with their support, Reuters published their report on the massacre. The shocking evidence they'd found was indisputable. Myanmar authorities acknowledged that the massacre had happened even as they prosecuted the reporters. Their trial and sentencing has sparked a global outcry, not least among colleagues. Reuters president and editor-in-chief Stephen J. Adler.
We view this as a wholly unwarranted, blatant attack on press freedom.
Rights groups and governments have called for the release of the 2 reporters. Journalists in Myanmar and around the world have protested the court's judgment. But Myanmar's civilian leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has defended the conviction of Wallon and Chasa'u.
It's not a matter of they were not jailed because they were journalists. They were jailed because the court has, sentence has been passed on them because the court has decided that they had broken the Official Secrets Act.
The families of the 2 reporters have appealed to Myanmar's authorities for their release. For young people in Myanmar, like Wallon and Chasa'u, Aung San Suu Kyi's sweetened the hunger for freedom in Myanmar after decades of brutal military rule. It's part of what drove the pair to become journalists, to serve the public by finding out the facts that form the bedrock of the rule of law in a democracy. While providing that service, Wallon and Chasa'u were wrongfully imprisoned and separated from their families.
ဘာပဲတိုင်မြေဖော်ရတယ်တိုင်မြေဖော်ရတယ်ပေါ့လင်းများနောက်တိုင်မြေအခုဆိုရင်ကိုတယောက်လေးပဲကိုဆိုလဲသူ့ကိုမကြာခဏရင်ဖွေးတာလို့ပါလို့ရှိတယ်သူဆိုလဲအဲ့လိုမျိုးရင်ဖွေးတာလို့ရှိတယ်ပေါ့အခုဟာကိုတယောက်လေးဖြစ်ကြနေရတယ်လို့တော်လေးကိုခံစားရတယ်သူဆိုလဲအဲ့လိုမျိုးပေါ့
Wallon and Chasa'u and Reuters will continue to fight for their freedom.
ဒီကျွန်တော်သမီးလေးတို့ကမတက်တင်ထားပဲပေါ့နော်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာပေါ့နော်ဒီလိုအမတ်တရားတွေကိုဖော်ထုတ်တဲ့လူတွေကဒီအကျဉ်းထောင်တွေအထက်မှာနေနေရတယ်ဆိုတာကိုလေကျွန်တော်သမီးလေးပြောအောင်ပေါ့နော်သူကြည့်လိုက်ရင်သူချက်တော့
Good morning. I'm Steve Adler, editor-in-chief of Reuters. It was a year ago this month that those 10 Muslim men and boys you just saw were brutally murdered in the village of Indin in Myanmar's Rakhine State. They were picked out of a crowd by paramilitary forces sent to secure the village in the midst of what the UN has described as ethnic cleansing. The oldest was 45, the youngest only 17. They were bound, made to kneel, led up a hill, hacked with swords, and shot to death. Their bodies were thrown into that one shallow grave. We have seen the awful photographs and know about the massacre because of the intrepid reporting of those 2 courageous journalists, Wallon and Chasa'u. They work for Reuters, the news organization that I run. We know about the massacre because they did what good reporters do. They talked to their sources. They traveled to the location of this incident. They spoke with witnesses of all backgrounds, interviewed officials, collected documentary evidence, and viewed the crime scene themselves. We know about the massacre in short because Wallon and Chasa'u went to Indin with open minds and left with facts. Except they didn't really get to leave, did they? Only the facts did. In an astonishing miscarriage of justice, our reporters were set up and arrested. A brigadier general who was angry that members of his command had talked to Wallon was behind the plan. The trap was simple, almost absurd. On December 12th, Wallon was summoned by police to an urgent meeting at a restaurant. There, he and his colleague, Cha So-u, were given documents rolled up in a newspaper and instructed to read them later. Then, when they left the restaurant, they were pounced on by police, who pretended to discover those very same documents. Their arrest was clearly aimed at unmasking Reuters sources and preventing us from publishing the account of the massacre. Intimidation was severe. Our reporters were handcuffed, hooded, continuously interrogated, threatened, and denied sleep. 2 weeks passed before their families, lawyers, or we at Reuters had any idea where they were. But once we'd made contact with them and completed their reporting, we published the explosive story of what happened at In Din. We published those photographs, too. Wallon and Cha So-u gave us full support in doing so. They wanted that story out. They are good men, devoted, hardworking husbands and fathers, though Wallon has yet to see his 1-month-old daughter, and Cha So-u has managed only brief hugs with his 3-year-old. More to the point, these men are patriotic citizens who want to see their country act morally and move closer to the rules-based democracy promised by Aung San Suu Kyi. Both chose journalism with a sincere belief that they could advance these goals by impartially uncovering facts and telling the truth. Both men embody what Reuters has made its mission for more than 160 years, to be strenuously impartial in our gathering of information. Reuters is known for its determination to report the facts, whatever they are and whomever they favor or offend. In the 166 countries where we operate, we remain committed to that goal, including in Myanmar, where our reporting continues. And make no mistake, what's happening in Myanmar and in the Rohingya refugee camps across the border in Bangladesh is vitally important to everyone in the world. And we will not be intimidated from pursuing these stories, despite the unjust prosecution of our journalists, and despite the fact that Myanmar's military has since imposed more restrictions on coverage of Rakhine State. However, the mistreatment of Wallon and Cha So-u is not just about these two reporters, or about Reuters, or even about Myanmar. The attack on them is a chilling warning to other journalists worldwide. Myanmar is not the only country where attempts are made to deter investigative news gathering, scare sources and whistleblowers, dim the spotlight of reporting, and thereby allow officials to act in darkness with impunity. The community of nations cannot condone this. We must stand for the rule of law, for the ideal and the practice of democracy, and those cannot flourish without the free flow of information. I want to say that we're grateful for all those who have stood by Wallon and Cha So-u for all this time. Our staff at Reuters, journalists around the world, press freedom groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, governments and diplomats, multinational organizations, and countless individuals, many of whom I see in this room. Wallon and Cha So-u were unjustly arrested, unjustly convicted, and unjustly sentenced. They should not be in prison for another day. And we will continue to advocate on their behalf until they are free. Thank you. And please welcome our next speaker, Amal Clooney, counsel to Wallon and Cha So-u.
Good morning, everyone. As we are gathered here today, 2 innocent men are in prison in Myanmar for doing nothing more than tell the truth. Wallon and Cha So-u, for almost a year, have been separated from their young families and paraded into a courtroom for a sham trial. Their conviction and draconian 7-year sentence are a travesty of justice, and it is up to the government to set them free. The prosecutor's story, accepted wholesale by the court, is not only fabricated, but totally implausible. They ask you to believe that Wallon and Cha So-u happened to be walking down the road one evening last December, carrying top-secret documents in their hands, when suddenly they were stopped at a vehicle checkpoint for looking suspicious. According to this account, police were shocked to find these documents on Wallon and Cha So-u, and in the spur of the moment decided to arrest them for being spies. It was simply a coincidence, we are told, that right at this time, Wallone and Chasa'u were working on a story about the brutal execution of 10 Rohingya men in Rakhine State, where the UN says Myanmar's security forces are committing the gravest crimes under international law. Of course, what really happened is that officials found out about the story and didn't want it to come out. So police planted government documents on the journalists while other officers lay in wait outside to arrest them. The journalists were arrested and were then prosecuted and subjected to a show trial in which their conviction was guaranteed. Let me highlight just 3 reasons why their trial was a miscarriage of justice. First, the prosecution's own witnesses have contradicted their case. A senior police officer who was expected to repeat the prosecution's lies shocked observers when in a packed courtroom he announced he felt compelled to preserve the integrity of his profession and tell the truth. He gave explosive testimony in open court, confirming that he heard a brigadier general from the police tell his subordinates to plant official documents on Wallone and then arrest him or face jail time themselves if they refused. After his heroic testimony, he was himself sentenced to 1 year in prison, and he's still in prison today. Other prosecution witnesses fell apart one by one on the stand. One witness literally read notes written on his hand to try and remember what he was supposed to say. Another was asked to provide his notes from the arrest, but said he had burnt them. Prosecutors claimed they could not locate a key witness, even though he was in detention at the time. And during police questioning, the officers didn't even pretend to be interested in the documents they had seized. Instead, they asked obsessively about who the journalist sources were in Rakhine and why they, as Buddhists, would even bother exposing crimes against Rohingyas. They even proposed to drop the charges if Reuters agreed to drop the story. Their offer was declined, but their own words made clear that their goal was always to bury the story. Second, there was a conviction without proof of a crime. A conviction under the Official Secrets Act requires that someone collected or shared material with intent to prejudice the state. But the documents that were in the journalists' hands when they were arrested were not state secrets. They were actually not even secret. And the journalists did not seek to harm the state. They were simply doing their job. But the judge entered a conviction anyway, because Wallone's old notebook included the phone number of a member of the Arakan Army, an armed group that Wallone was reporting on when he worked for the Myanmar Times. The judge could not point to any contact with this phone number, but found that the journalist was still guilty because, quote, the number was evidence that, quote, there are opportunities for the defendants to transmit security information to anti-government groups. Opportunities. Well, how convenient. Instead of the prosecution having to prove guilty conduct beyond doubt, the defense has to prove that such conduct is not theoretically possible. That makes this a conviction without a crime. Third, the trial violated every meaningful right to due process. The court was clearly not independent or impartial. How could a fair-minded judge convict on this evidence? The journalists were not given sufficient information about the charges. They were denied access to key evidence. They were questioned for weeks without a lawyer present. They were brought to a secret interrogation center. They were held incommunicado. They were hooded, forced to kneel, dragged on the floor, and denied sleep, and pressured to sign statements against their will. Exculpatory evidence was hidden or destroyed. Most fundamentally, there was no presumption of innocence, rather a predetermination of guilt. And you don't need to take my word for it. Every single observer of this trial has agreed that it was a farce. In Myanmar, young people took to the streets to protest the conviction. The Press Council and 83 civil society groups criticized the judgment. Senior members of the governing party called the prosecution unfair, and local media published blacked-out front pages in solidarity with the two journalists. Across the region, press associations and parliamentarians from Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia all condemned the verdict. And around the world, officials from the United Nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU, Canada, Australia, and Bangladesh, newspapers including the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Economist, and Le Monde, as well as every major free press NGO in the world, agree that this conviction is a travesty of justice. So, what can now be done? For months, Myanmar's government has been asked this question, and they've replied, well, the case is in the courts. There's nothing we can do to intervene. Well, now it's not in the courts, and they can intervene. Under Article 204 of Myanmar's constitution, the president can grant a pardon at any time after a conviction. He does so following consultation with Myanmar's leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who said on her first day in office that priority to release prisoners of conscience. The journalists' families have already submitted a pardon request, and in previous cases, a pardon has been granted as soon as 4 days following a conviction. This case began with authorization from the government at the highest level, all the way up to the president's office, and the government can, if it wants to, end it today. But earlier this month, Aung San Suu Kyi defended this prosecution and challenged anyone who has read the judgment to explain what was wrong with it. In her words, if anybody feels there has been a miscarriage of justice, I would like them to point it out. Well, my remarks today are intended to answer Aung San Suu Kyi's call, and indeed, as counsel to Reuters and the two journalists, it is my duty to do so. But Aung San Suu Kyi has herself spoken of the need for a free press if Myanmar is to transition to a full democracy. She has praised the value of journalism in revealing wrongdoing and said that freedom begins with freedom of speech. She knows that mass murder is not a state secret and that exposing it doesn't turn a journalist into a spy. She is the Nobel Peace Prize winner whose name was whispered in the halls of St. Hugh's College, Oxford, where she and I both studied. When I was a student, she was a hero to me, as she has been to so many human rights advocates around the world and to so many of the 50 million people in Myanmar whose lives she promised to change. She allowed young people to hope for a free Myanmar that respected the rule of law, and her own life story made them believe that it was possible. Aung San Suu Kyi knows better than anyone what it is like to be a political prisoner in Myanmar. She has slept in a cell at the prison where Walloon and Chasau now sleep. But today, she holds the key to their liberty, the key to reuniting them with their young children, the key to freedom of the press, the key to truth and accountability, and the key to a more democratic and prosperous Myanmar. History will judge her on her response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal. Thank you, Steve. The list of journalists jailed around the world is long. In fact, it's never been longer. But I want to focus now on 3 other journalists from that list who, like Walloon and Chau So-u, are unjustly jailed in reprisal for reporting on stories of global significance. Shahidul Alam is a renowned photojournalist, commentator, and founder of a Bangladeshi multimedia organization. His photographs of street life, political protest, and Bangladesh's ecological challenges have captivated his country and the world. Last month, Shahidul was arrested while covering student protests in Bangladesh. A day later, a Dhaka court ordered that he be held for 7 days to determine if he had violated Section 57 of the Information and Communication Technology Act by spreading propaganda and false information. When Shahidul was brought into court, he screamed that he had been tortured, He was unable to walk without assistance. Nearly 2 months later, he remains behind bars. As with Wallon and Chao So-u, Shahidul's case is rife with due process violations. The American Bar Association Center for Human Rights released a report that concluded the entire criminal process, this is in quotes, the entire criminal process against Dr. Alam has been only a means of intimidation and retaliation and a gross subversion of Bangladesh's justice system. And I have just learned that Shahidul's family is here with us, and I'd like you to stand, please. Please stand up. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much. Can I just say this is the kind of support, the kind of response we need from the international community to resolve these terrible cases of injustice. And I want to make a point. Around the world, 52% of all journalists in prison are in jail for reporting on human rights. I want to talk about another one. Azimjan Askarov, he's another example. He's a journalist and human rights defender from Kyrgyzstan who has been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail. He has already been in prison since July 2010. Askarov's crime, covering deadly ethnic clashes between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks in southern Kyrgyzstan in the summer of 2010. During his trial, Askarov and his lawyer were both assaulted. Exculpatory testimony from his wife and neighbors was ignored. CPJ conducted its own investigation into the case in 2012 and found that charges against Askarov were in retaliation for his reporting on corrupt and abusive practices by regional police and prosecutors. Askarov himself told CPJ that authorities had long threatened him, probably because he had exposed fabricated criminal cases, arbitrary detentions, and the rape and abusive treatment of detainees in his native Jalalabad region. The UN Human Rights Committee looked into Askarov's case and found that numerous violations took place between the day of his arrest and sentencing. In early 2016, that body called on Kyrgyzstan to release Askarov. This summer, CPJ asked for permission to visit Askarov in prison. The Kyrgyz government said no. Today, we are calling on President Jeenbekov to use his authority to free Askarov and unequivocally commit to protecting press freedom. We call on member states to insist that President Jeenbekov and the Kyrgyz government comply with the recommendations of the UN Human Rights Committee. I want to turn to another country and another case. It's beyond sad that repression continues to mount in Egypt. Since 2013, that country has been among the world's worst jailers of journalists, according to CPJ research. Of the 20 journalists in Egyptian jails last year, some have faced politically motivated anti-state charges, but others face charges for publishing false news. Among them is Aleh Abdulfetteh, a prominent bloggerist who has written about politics and human rights for numerous outlets. Aleh is serving a 5-year prison sentence on charges that he organized a protest and assaulted a police officer. We believe the charges are trumped up and in retaliation for Aleh's coverage of alleged human rights abuses committed by the police themselves and the security forces. We hope that Aleh will be released soon. But when that day comes, his ordeal will not be over because of draconian parole conditions that will require him to spend each night in a local police station. Photojournalist Mahmoud Abu Zayed, known as Shao Khan, is an object lesson in the absurdity of the Egyptian criminal justice system. Shao Khan was arrested in 2014 and held for 5 years without charge. He was recently convicted and sentenced to time served, but he has still not been released. Governments around the world routinely use emergency laws to censor media outlets and publications. Increasingly, they also bring fake news charges against journalists who contradict official statements. They try journalists in military courts. They hold them in pretrial detention indefinitely. These are all actions that contradict international human rights law and the standards set by the UN. Few countries have been held to account for their repressive practices. One of the reasons is that key international bodies like the United Nations and its member states follow a diplomatic protocol and refuse to name names. Even leading democracies abide by this custom. Why are they afraid to stand up for their values? The General Assembly must be more than a parade of speeches. The UN has taken action on the issue of journalist safety through a series of resolutions, a plan of action, and the engagement of the Secretary General's office. We are very grateful for these efforts. But today, we are asking the UN to expand its engagement in response to the record number of journalists imprisoned around the world. And we are asking member states that support press freedom to speak out about these abuses and to demand answers. The jailing of journalists around the world is successfully censoring coverage of key global issues and violating our collective right to seek and receive information vital to public understanding. This is an issue that the UN can no longer ignore. And now we are happy to take your questions, all of us. My colleague, Courtney Raj, she's over there. She's going to moderate. I ask only one thing. Please be brief, and by brief, I mean around a minute. And we will be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to call on the permanent representative from the UK, of the UK, the Honourable Alistair Burt, Minister of State for the Middle East and North Africa, and the Minister of State at the Department for International Development, to make a brief remark.
Thank you very much, and to Steve, Joel, and Amal, thank you very much for leading this and for the efforts of those who've convened it. It's much appreciated by the UK government. My Prime Minister, Theresa May, said something in the Chamber earlier this week that bears repeating. She said, and I quote, "Like many leaders, I suspect I do not always enjoy reading what the media in my country writes about me to write. But I will defend their right to say it, for the independence of our media is one of my country's greatest achievements. It is the bedrock of our democracy." It's uncomfortable for us, and sometimes it's uncomfortable for our friends, because this issue knows no boundaries. Because freedom of expression is not just a fundamental right in itself. It also underpins good governance, public accountability, and respect for all human rights. That was a quote from the Commonwealth Principles on Freedom of Expression and the Role of the Media, which was launched by the Commonwealth Association of Journalists at the Heads of Government meeting in April. It highlights the role of a free and independent media in holding those in power to account. This is why press freedom is so essential to democracy. Yet, as we've heard, it's under threat in many places. Journalists are threatened, intimidated, or attacked. Hundreds are in detention. And in the first half of this year alone, 47 have been killed. This is totally unacceptable. And the United Kingdom calls on all states to create an environment in which journalists can work in safety. Respect for fundamental freedoms and the rule of law is something that British ministers regularly raise with governments around the world. When our Foreign Secretary met Aung San Suu Kyi last week, he expressed concern at the convictions of the Reuters journalists of Wallon and Chassou, and urged Burma to respect freedom of expression and rule of law. I raised concerns about freedom of expression with the government of Bangladesh in July and encouraged them to engage with civil society to address concerns over the Information and Communications Technology Act. We remain concerned about the mass arrest of student demonstrators. We've also asked the Egyptian authorities to release journalists and political detainees, to review mass judicial decisions, and to remove restrictions on civil society. This meeting, this body, the response of this audience to the families of those caught up in this, speaks volumes and demonstrates still the ability of this place to command collective action to do something about it. The United Kingdom will continue and to promote and defend freedom of expression and a free and independent media as an essential part of a secure and prosperous democratic body throughout the world. Those of us close to journalists, either through our roles and sometimes through our families, owe these brave people no less and will continue to promote their freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to call on the permanent representative from Germany.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I would like to commend you for being here today and giving your support to the very noble cause. Germany has always supported all the UN General Assembly resolutions that deal with the freedom of media. And we have been elected for the Security Council and will be there in 2019 and 2020. And in our campaign, we clearly said that for us, human rights will be very important. Human rights and security will be a very important item, and we want to put that on the agenda. We said that before the election, and then we were voted with 184 out of 190 votes. So we will have the legitimacy also to raise that in the Security Council. On the campaign here, I can only echo what speakers have said. Germany also supports the appeal to Aung San Suu Kyi to grant pardon to the journalists. And we also support, of course, the drive towards giving freedom to all the journalists that are behind bars. We had today in Germany President Erdogan and the Chancellor in her talks also openly demanded the freedom for journalists, and we have many Turkish journalists in Germany right now who had to flee Turkey because they were not allowed to do their job there, are threatened to be put behind bars because in some cases they did something similar as the journalists did in Myanmar. They wrote about something that was done and where the government didn't want this to come to the public. So freedom of press is core of the human rights. We will defend that, and we have to note that we have these record numbers of people being behind bars. The criticism of the media worldwide, the independence of media is put under question. You have sometimes even selection of journalists who are allowed for a press conference and things like this. I think we have to fight this, and Germany will do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to call on the permanent representative from Lebanon to make a brief remark.
I'm sorry, I came here not prepared because I was in another meeting, but I'm going to say some remarks, and I will start them with the personal experience. As a young student in Lebanon in the 80s, a formative experience really taught me a big lesson. At that time, Salim Lawzi, who was a journalist and owner of a magazine, was kidnapped and killed in Lebanon. But that was not the worst part of it. The worst part was they poured acid on his right hand. And at that time, journalists used to write with longhand. They did not have laptops and computers. That was a message to all the journalists in Lebanon and the Arab world, that this is what happens to you if you use your right hand. I went on and I became a journalist, but this was the most difficult experience for me as a young journalist, and I will never forget that. And this brought me now, when I knew this meeting is happening, to tell you that despite of all the problems that we have in Lebanon, we're still one of the most freest countries in terms of free press. We're not perfect, but we are doing a very good job compared to everybody. And we support the free press. It's part of our constitution, it's part of our culture and our life. And I support all the people who are here, your cause, and I hope that we reach a day when journalists will not be killed, imprisoned, and their right hands will not be burned. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we'd like to open up the floor to Q&A. If you're interested in raising a question, please push the silver button, and then I will call on you and recognize you. And if you could please identify yourself as well before asking the question. And again, please do keep it brief. I see first here in the back. Please go ahead. You? Yes.
Again. Virginia Jeffries from CUNY Graduate School of Journalism and the New York City News Service. My question is for Amal Clooney and Joel Simon in particular. After the sentencing, we saw a lot of people, private organizations, as you mentioned, like the New Yorker, ProPublica, Time Magazine, make semi-official statements of solidarity on social media. And I'm wondering, is that best for them, or is that going to come back to bite them later? Will it be distorted? I know that there sort of seem to be building a case that they've been sent by, international bodies trying to subvert the Burmese government. Is this good for them? Should we do that?
Hi, thank you for the question. I think responsible reporting about the verdict is absolutely helpful and appropriate, and certainly we would never seek to stop it anyway. I think, they would be heartened to know, the two journalists sitting in prison are heartened to know that they're getting this kind of response from other fellow journalists around the world, and as long as the commentary is accurate, then I think it's absolutely appropriate and helpful too.
I'll say a word, and maybe, Steve, you want to also comment. I think that, when journalists are in prison for their work, and the entire profession needs to stand together and speak out. And so I think it's welcome. And I have a lot of experience, too much experience over many years, of talking to journalists who've been imprisoned. And one of the things that sustains them is this kind of public outcry from their colleagues. So I think it accomplishes two things. I think it's the right thing to do for journalists and media organizations, and I think it's a powerful message of support for the journalists who are imprisoned and who are isolated and alone.
Just to add that the most important thing journalists can do to honor other journalists in prison is to do good, factual, honest journalism. So to continue reporting on what's happening not only in Myanmar, but every place else in the world, it really does honor those journalists. And I think it was particularly significant that Wallone and Jossou were so passionate about our going ahead, finishing their reporting, and writing the story about that massacre, because the whole point is not us, it's reporting the facts and letting the world know about them.
I saw that there was a hashtag online, which was #ArrestMeToo, that other journalists said, well, if what they've done is a crime, then what every journalist does is a crime, because all they did was, follow the evidence, follow leads, ask questions from all sides, and then report what they learned and report the truth. So I think, that is true, and the solidarity there is important. And it's also why, as Steve said, this isn't just a case about two men. This is a case about the ability of any journalist in Myanmar and further afield to report, because the reason governments take on these cases is because they want them to affect. So not only do they bury one story, but then they, the rest of the journalistic community will start to self-censor, and we've seen that in many countries around the world. So just to echo what my colleagues are saying, I think it is actually incredibly important.
Thank you. Before continuing on to questions, I'd just like to invite the Ambassador for Human Rights of France to make a brief intervention.
Thank you very much. My name is François Croquette. I'm the French Ambassador for Human Rights. I would just like to thank the organizers for this meeting. It is very important, we believe, that we address the case of this journalist within the framework of the General Assembly. As you know, France has condemned the sentencing of the two journalists from Reuters, Wallone and Kwao-Soou, to 7 years. These sentences, we believe, are a serious attack on freedom of press and the rule of law in Burma. France repeats its call for their release and for their fundamental rights to be respected, and of course for the media to be given free access to the Rakhine State. During this meeting, France co-hosted a ministerial meeting on Monday on Burma, during which their case was addressed. We also have launched an initiative for the protection of journalists worldwide, and I would like to recall that the French daily newspaper Le Monde has published the report of Walloon and Kwasuhu front page, and that the campaign in France for their release will continue until it has been achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite the U.S. Ambassador to ECOSOC, Elizabeth Curry, to make a brief intervention.
It's already, oh, there we go. Thank you. First, I would love to thank Reuters and the Committee to Protect Journalists and the panelists for convening this important meeting today. On behalf of the U.S. mission to the United Nations and Ambassador Haley, I want to express our continued support for the release of Walloon and Kwasuhu. These two journalists were just doing their job, as has been amply stated today, and journalism is not a crime. Doing good journalism should never be a crime, and we stand in solidarity with them and their families and the other journalists who have been unjustly detained around the world. Ambassador Haley has spoken out very strongly on this case, both publicly and directly with the authorities of the Burmese government, and do so. And we will continue to highlight their case as one of the most egregious examples of oppression of freedom of the press and freedom of expression in the world today. Further to that, I would like to highlight an initiative that the United States will be taking this fall in the General Assembly in the Third Committee to submit a new resolution on freedom of association and assembly. And in this resolution, we will specifically highlight the need to protect media workers who are covering protests, who are meeting with dissidents, and who are bringing to attention the voices of those who oppose authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, and governments that are sliding into authoritarianism, whether they're democratic on the surface or otherwise. We are looking forward to working with other member states here at the UN to support this new resolution in the Third Committee, and we welcome the different delegations that are here today to reach out to us to work with us on this resolution. We think it's very important to highlight the role that media workers in particular play, not only in protecting freedom of expression, but also protecting the other fundamental freedoms of association and assembly by covering when others are protesting, covering when others are speaking out against injustice. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to once again open it up for questions, and I'd actually also encourage you to raise your hand because it's a little bit hard to see the green lights. And I'd like to first ask that members of the media who are here to ask questions, we're going to take your questions first and then open it up more broadly. So I see a question back there on the 1, 2, 3, 4 rolls in, I believe, with the Wall Street Journal. Press your button one more time so it's red.
Hi there, my name's Jay Conti. I'm the general counsel from the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones. I'd first just like to applaud Reuters and its counsel for its full-throated defense of their two reporters. It's really admirable the lengths that you all have gone to support your folks who are in prison, and we clearly support you. It's a travesty, and the case is tough to watch and to follow. And in this scenario, I imagine your objective has to be getting them out of prison as quickly as possible. But my one question for you is, by asking for a pardon, are you concerned that some could interpret that as conceding guilt?
Thanks very much for the question, and I think it's an important question because it can be misunderstood. We have supported the family's request for a pardon because at this moment that is the only way for them to be free. The families in their pardon request have made clear that their husbands, the request comes from the two wives, that their husbands did not commit a crime and that they're not guilty of any crime. But at this point, the case is no longer in the courts, and it's squarely in the lap of the government. And the government can issue a pardon, as I said in my earlier remarks. So we're appealing to that process because it's the only way for part of the injustice to be remedied, the part that is about them being imprisoned. Obviously, the actual, full remedy that we would wish for is for an acknowledgement that they never committed a crime, for their conviction to be cancelled. But for the time being, this is the mechanism under Myanmar law by which we can get them released, and obviously we're going to pursue it as enthusiastically as we can at this juncture.
Thank you. I see a question from the media up. Yes, with your hand raised. Thank you. Please identify yourself.
Can't get the there we go. Hi, Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera here. I know in Myanmar, Facebook came under a lot of pressure for allowing hate speech to, and people associated with the military to have accounts on Facebook. I'm wondering how you reconcile free speech rights on social media with the rights of journalists. Is there a tension there, and how do you reconcile that? Yes, that's my question. Thanks.
I think one way to think about it is when we engage with Facebook and with social media companies, we engage on both sides of this issue. So sometimes our concern is that particular actionable threats are being made against journalists, and so our concern is that this content be removed. And other times, that same framework is used to actually remove critical and valid journalistic speech. So there's no question that it's a difficult issue, and I think that the companies, frankly, have to have both responsibilities. I mean, they have to figure out a way to keep speech that actually endangers people, and in the case you mentioned, actually can inspire mass violence, and they have to figure out a way to do that while preserving fundamental right to free expression and the rights of journalists to report the news. So I'm not going to give you an easy formula, but I'm going to say it's something that is a point of constant dialogue that we and many organizations that are focused on this issue have with the companies.
Thank you. The Associated Press. So push it one more time to get it read. Okay, there you go.
My name is Brian Carvellano. I'm Vice President and Managing Editor of the AP. I'm here with my colleagues Karen Kaiser, who is the AP's General Counsel, and Ian Phillips, who is Vice President and Director of International News. I do have a question, but I just want to say real quick that we're here in solidarity with our colleagues at Reuters and at CPJ. We may be competitors, but we are all journalists. And when it comes to advocating for press freedom, we are partners. And we are here in support of Cha So-u and Wallone and all of the journalists around the world who have been wrongfully imprisoned. My question is, in the excellent Reuters investigation of Indin, names were named. Do we have any idea what happened to some of those folks? Have they faced any sort of justice whatsoever? And is there any hope of that?
There was actually an acknowledgement by the military that the facts that were reported in the piece were correct. And according to them, 7 people have been prosecuted for the crimes that were reported in the piece. We can't necessarily independently verify that second part, but it's striking that there are many denials of many allegations that have been made. But when it comes to this story, the government couldn't deny it because they said it was overwhelming evidence. It was evidence not only based on survivor testimony, but also testimony military people, from eyewitnesses, from local Buddhist villages in Indin. So there was no way to really deny the facts, and actually the facts that were reported there have now been, confirmed in government reports where governments have issued sanctions and by the UN and others. So there was an acknowledgement of the truth of what they reported, and apparently there's also been some accountability, which would be a very isolated incident, if true.
Yes. Please don't forget to identify yourself. Thank you. Press that one more time. Yep.
Thank you. Katie Riley from Time Magazine, and my question is for Amal Clooney. I wonder, in light of the International Criminal Court's recent ruling that it has jurisdiction to investigate crimes by non-member states with cross-border outcomes, I wonder, do you think that development could have any impact on future involvement in this case or on justice for the Rohingya people in general? And do you believe that that ruling could be a turning point in the prosecution of crimes against humanity globally?
I think it is a turning point when it comes to this conflict. I think there's been sort of escalating measures. We saw yesterday that the Human Rights Council issued a resolution saying that following the work of the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar, there's now going to be a team of lawyers and others who are going to build prosecution files that target specific alleged perpetrators. And I think the ICC is the other side of that, where they say, Myanmar is not a member of the ICC, but because Bangladesh is, and because there's been this mass deportation of over 700,000 people who've had to flee Myanmar to go to Bangladesh, they have jurisdiction over some crimes. So essentially it's the crime against humanity of forced deportation and then potentially associated crimes that wouldn't cover all the crimes that the UN fact-finding mission has said may have been committed. So it's a step, but it doesn't necessarily lead to full accountability as things stand.
Right, can I ask if there are any other members of the media who would like to ask a question? Please, here.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn Leopold, resident UN correspondent, and Steve, 40 years with Reuters. Has any action been taken, or could pressure be put on those who deliver arms to the Burmese military? Russia, China, there are others, India, even Israel.
Gail Gove, our general counsel at Reuters, is going to address that.
I mean, I think we've addressed all possible options at our disposal. We've had many conversations with many people around the world who are in a position to help us and to engage in quiet diplomacy, and we will continue to do that until they're free.
Thank you. Any other members of the media, if you can just raise your hand. All right. So at this point, I'd like to invite Margot Ewan, the Director of Reporters Without Borders in the U.S., to make a brief remark.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you to Reuters, to CPJ, to Amal Clooney for this wonderful event. We too, at Reporters Without Borders, stand in solidarity with all journalists in prison. I wanted to highlight that 56 professional journalists have already been killed in 2018, surpassing 2017's tally at this time last year, and 697 have been killed since 2012's adoption of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. So the UN must actually take into account, as Joel has said, that in addition to deaths, violent threats against journalists, imprisonment of journalists is another popular method of silencing journalists from reporting stories that impact us all and depriving us of our right to information. And unfortunately, many journalists who are in prison do end up losing their lives. They are subjected to horrific detention conditions. Sometimes they're released only to die months later because they were denied adequate medical care. We need to continue, as we are doing today, to raise these threats and attacks against the freedom to report and the right to information as we witness a growing hatred of journalists around the world, which unfortunately is not limited to authoritarian regimes. We are seeing democratically elected regimes also attack the press more and more frequently, which is why we need to continue to address wrongs as they occur publicly. And we need to underline that a free press is not an adversary, but an essential component of democracy. Unfortunately, as verbal attacks against the press grow, so do physical attacks. And we also need the international community not only to condemn, but to highlight and lead by example in their own countries by respecting the press, by respecting their right to report. We are very pleased with the steps that the United Nations has taken so far to strengthen its response to journalist safety. We ask them to go as far as possible by truly establishing an emergency response mechanism to prevent the loss of lives of journalists, and also to prevent journalists from being jailed and further silenced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Could you please hit your button once so it turns green and raise your hand? Yes, here, in the yellow. And then push your button one more time so it turns red. Oddly enough, you can speak when it's red.
Hi, my name is Wasfia Nazreen. Although Dr. Shahidul Alam is a friend and like a father to me, my question here is as a Bangladeshi youth. When Dr. Shahidul Alam went out into the streets to cover the student protests that broke out, he was representing the youth. He came out to protect us. And then he was arrested, and then at the same time, he was not the only journalist who was arrested and beat up by pro-government activists. There were AP journalists and Reuters journalists, and it's all well documented. The current government also, while this was going on, introduced a new digital act. And while this is all happening in Bangladesh, our government, our PM was honored by the UN right in this very building yesterday, and she was given a humanitarian award by the IPS. And my question is to all of you, also to Amal Clooney, that how do we tackle this when the UN itself is endorsing her? And we, of course, appreciate her efforts into taking in refugees for Myanmar, and she deserves those accolades. But at the same time, what her government has been doing to citizens in Bangladesh, that needs to be questioned. And she needs to be questioned in the UN. Thank you.
Well, I think you really zeroed in on, in my view, what engagement from the international community has to look like. There certainly are instances in which governments deserve recognition and leaders deserve recognition, but part of the engagement has to be based around a critical principle that respect for the rights of journalists and free expression is fundamental. So if you are even if you have some positive policies that are being recognized at the same time that that engagement occurs, there has to be a principled commitment to raise in a forthright and honest way the challenges, and that's what I often fail to see. And that's my criticism. I think the international community, when it engages through the UN, has to maintain a commitment to those principles, and often they're lacking.
I think that at a time when the world's governments are closing their doors to refugees, Bangladesh should be commended for taking in so many under such dire circumstances. But at the same time, I fully support what you say, that doesn't mean they get a free pass on any other violations they may be committing. Absolutely, they should be, other governments and the UN itself should be taking a principled stance on this issue. We know it doesn't always happen. We know it's highly selective. But I also know, when we approach a case like this, we try and use all the tools in our toolbox. So sometimes there's legal recourse, there's diplomatic recourse, there's financial recourse, and there's public. And I think in terms of state-to-state pressure, sometimes states will say, well, quiet diplomacy is more helpful at this juncture, and sometimes they'll be public about it. So, of course, when they say quiet diplomacy, you have to make sure it's quiet diplomacy as opposed to doing nothing. There comes a time when you can't really be quiet anymore, and people should be speaking out. And I absolutely agree with you. The UN should always be doing that when it comes to press freedom matters.
See a question from Nancy from the Tahrir Institute.
Is it working? Yes. Thank you so much. My question is and the media law. Wondering, right, what editors and others could do onto that.
Well, to answer for Reuters, the developments in Egypt to necessarily media report on the developments that are occurring there. That for the Egyptian government has adopted this goes to in Egypt to work to the government. The other challenge is global incredible happening. Events like President Trump's latest tweet. Out something that system.
I'd say just a number at my we're tipping 30 and dissipating for our own reporters. We're not an advocacy. Well, and we have a perspective of what's going on in Egypt. What our role is.
Journalist who was in prison. As ago, helped yesterday was has become, very
for you about something tensions with the Myanmar proof. Have opportunity for new, how do you navigate? And practice expected to
yeah, exactly. After, yeah, confirm that 10 others discard that. Wing to the executive branch. Can't when matters that are so frequently of for the need for respect for those kinds of processes. And, she has said one political prisoner is one too many. So we're hopeful that these step in, the courts can't do it themselves.
Sure.
Speaking for the of your group. Is imprisoned identified and we turns to release
how Ambassador Haya has on and military Congress and some bills introduced. Have bipartisan support. The world could be doing more. Through measures that they think can be taken that would move things in the right direction. I mean, remember, the on the rights. This is coming. That's the government to do, and any.
Okay. It's on the issue we don't and about. Basically. You do as a.
Just you, self.
I'm at NYU, and I'm asking this as a journalism student and also as someone that grew up in Brazil, and where a lot more violent. Can you tell if there's any regarding prevention?
You had the question. Sure, you're not advisors. Go journalist movement with permits with on the do that. Many of these of journalisms like CPJ and others are Also dangerous. In addition to Joel, to
the kind of system. Starts with the kind of local journalists working in their own communities, maybe station, maybe local ones that include local, and even the major international, by reading the local press and interacting with the local journalists, you can't cover a you have to all the we can or have an urgency to journalists who are environment.
Has been working with her team for many months and help their journalists and to make sure that they can get out of prison and go back to doing the work they do so brilliantly. These journalists they can get out before. That's in work to stop working on.
That is Shamima Khan. Registration CPJ. Sponsored us. Thank you so much. Sure on. We are very worried about this with their list. Shahidul goes to court. He stays there for a couple of hours. He is told that, oh, he has done this way. This has been going on for a while. And these are the kinds of things that kind of tend to take attention away. And as things come up, and people don't stay focused on one issue forever. So I do want everybody to think about and others in your own capacity in your bilaterals, ask our Prime Minister, what's going on? Every round I would like to hear somebody say, just explain to me what's going on. And I think that alone brings it becomes difficult to avoid that question every single time. So we really need, because we are in it for the long haul, and we hope that the haul doesn't get longer. It's are upcoming in Bangladesh. We're very worried that Shahidul will not be let go of before the elections are. Should be worried about that, because your voices are not simply your own. Your responsibility is to has Pathshala, which is a training institute for journalists. So it's not this generation of going to follow you. It's our life.
And
We have time for only one more question. I see Ellery Biddle from Global Voice.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Steve Adler a question. So Joel was just talking about media logging or Facebook. Powerful Western media institutions. I'm wondering if like this for Reuters and for other big media, does it make you think more about covering threats against journalists working that they too critical?
Thank you. Here's validity as well. Just a few big journalism organizations would commit to essentially treating freelance their own staff, go way at who we protection, same thing we'd be also provide to freelance to our people out there that are everywhere in the world. So much that cover where sort of make the more reaching out in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. I mean, you know, CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, or in this arena, you know, part of our model is to make that easier, honestly, by investigating violation in a week, and we have a lot of credibility. These are national managements, and we're not making lots of information so that when a newspaper, you know, when that happens, we know what the competitions don't want to be accused. But when they do, and it's a lot of the diplomatic nature of a powerful tool you know, I read is always organized.
Your support. You have the hashtags to use in your advocacy, and you know, remember that. And thank you again for coming and.
I'm the director. Promote rights of journalists. And referring to rights of journalists. Last world and we've been pleased to see an increasing willingness to speak out on these issues, even acknowledge that change much for journalists on the ground. But there has been one issue around which it has been difficult to engage. That's the unjust imprisonment of journalists around the world. That is because governments are directly responsible for these grave abuses, of rarely calling out its members. But the jailing of journalists has reached unprecedented levels. At the end of 22 journalists jailed around the world, the highest number ever recorded by CPJ. The jailing of journalists on the flow of information around the world. The time has come to speak. The name Turkey was the world's leading jailer of journalists, with 73 journalists behind bars. Together, these three countries jail 134 journalists. And all of the world, all the journalists that are in prison in all the other countries of the world. But at today's event, the numbers. The journalists we will highlight today are reporters who have the world informed. We've selected 5 cases in Bangladesh, Egypt, and Myanmar. Reporters have been sentenced to 7 years in prison on They have reported on a story of violates the rights of everyone in this room. Foundational UN document through any means do so when the people leader assembly this presenting while watch
Our journalists guilty of in Myanmar, which the authorities later In August 2017, a military crackdown began in western Myanmar that has since sent 700,000 Rohingya during Bangladesh security. Buddhist villagers alone. A village elder gave them 3 photos. Haya Muslim first hit. Verified with booters of the for 2 weeks they disappeared. When he desperate. Months up to and during their trial. During that time, Pan E gave birth to the couple's first child. Chitsuwin, he's already missed many milestones in her young life. After their arrest, Wallon and Chasa'u were put in black hoods and taken terror for 3 days. After 2 weeks, they were transferred to Myanmar's notorious. Nonetheless, the shocking evidence they'd found was indisputable. Massacre has sparked a global outcry. Among colleagues.
Press freedom.
Rights group government judgment. Aung San Suu Kyi.
A journalist. A sentence that called fact.
So the young Aung San Suu Kyi's sharpened freedom in Myanmar after decades of brutal military rule. It's part of what becomes that service. And Reuters.
Good morning. I'm Steve Adler, Editor-in-Chief of Reuters. those 10 Muslim were brutal. Out of a crowd, as the oldest 5, they were bound, made to kneel, led up a hill, hacked with swords, and shot to death. Bodies were thrown into that one shallow grave. We have seen the awful photographs and know about the massacre. Courageous journalists, Wallone and Chauceau. They work for Reuters, the news organization. About the massacre, did what good reporters do. They talked to their sources. They traveled to the locals, collected documentary evidence, and viewed the crime scene themselves. In with open minds and left with facts. Except in this miscarriage of justice, our reporters were set up and arrested. A brigadier that known. The trap was simple, almost absurd. On December 12th, were given documents rolled up in a newspaper and instructed to read them later. On by pendants. Their arrest was our reporters were handcuffed, interrogated. Leaders had any idea where they were. And its photographs too. While included hardworking husbands and fathers, also briefed them are patriotic citizens. Journalism with a gather determination to or remain committed to refugee camps across the important to fight the unjust prosecution that has over the mistreatment report warning it's not the only country to skim the and those two nations cannot condone this. We must stand for the rule of deal of democracy, free flow. I want to all us time. Entrance I see in this room. arrest and for another day. And we thank you. And
as we are gathered here today, 2 innocent men are in prison. Wallone and Chassa'u, for almost a year, have been separated from their young families and draconian 7-year sentence are a travesty of justice, and it is up to the government. Accepted wholesale by the court is not only fabricated, but totally implausible. That were walking down the road one evening last December, carrying top secret documents in their hands. According to this account, police were shocked to find these documents. Spur of the moment for being spies. It was simply a coincidence, we are told. Brutal execution of 10 Rohingya men in Rakhine State. Myanmar the goal. Of course, what really happened officials found planted government documents on the journalists while other officers lay in wait outside. And were to a show trial in which their conviction was guaranteed. Why was a miss? First, the prosecution's own witnesses have contradicted when in a packed courtroom he announced he felt compelled in open court, confirming that he heard Brigadier and then arrest him, jail time themselves if they refused. Heroic testimony in prison today. Other prosecution witnesses felt on the stand. No. Another was asked to provide them. They couldn't mention at the time. Even obsessively about who the journalists saw. As Rohingyas proposed to drop the charges that carry the story. There were potential secrets. Arrested were not states. On the job. Wallone army that Wallone was for the time. This was still guilty because, quote, opportunities in the you should guilt doubt such conduct possible. Without a crime. Third, the trial violated every meaningful right to due process. Or judge information about the charges. They were held, they were hooded. Dragged through. And you don't need test. Exercise. Front journalists. Across the region, press associations and parliamentarians from Singapore, Thailand, and Indonesia, all around the world, officials from the United Nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, New York Times, that this conviction is a travesty of justice. So, what months Myanmar and asked the president congratulated Aung San Suu Kyi, who said on her first day in office, just pardon. The president's office. And execution. Fears. To answer to Roy Hujan, duty to do as free proceed. And begin. And that's where she united so many human rights and she allowed young people the rule of law. In the prison where we're today, and with the key to truth and accountability, and the key to a more prosperity will judge her on her response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal. Thank you, Steve. The list of journalists has never been longer, but I want to focus now on 3 other journalists from that list who in reprisal for reporting on stories of global significance. Alam, commentator of a Bangladeshi multimedia organization. His photographs of street life hated his country and the world. Last month, Shahidul was arrested in Bangladesh. A Dhaka court ordered that he be held for 7 days to determine if he had violated Section 50 spreading and false information. When Shahidul without assistance. Nearly 2 months later, he remains case is process violations. The American Bar Association sent concluded process against Dr. Alam has been a mission system. And I have just learned that Shah stand up. Thank you so much. The kind of to resolve these. The world reporting on human. Otherwise, he's from Kyrgyzstan who has been sentenced to spend Askarov's corroborating between Askarov is only conducted into the case in charge of reporting practices by regional told him was fabricated right. Garv's case of his arrest and sentencing. In early 2006, he called to release this summer into Kyrgyz. President Jembekari to calls to insist I want to turn to another case. 2010 world's journalists, according to CPJ research. Of the 20 journalists in jails last year, some among them is Aleh Abdul Fattah, a rights lies on charges that he organized a protest. We believe retaliation for alleged coverage of alleged soon. But when that day comes, local police station, photojournalist in 2014. About 3 times. Against journalists. Official statements. All actions untried for their national member and refuse to name about phrase be taken through a series of resolutions to expand freedom to speak on the key global issue right. This is an issue that the UN can no longer. Now we are. I ask only. And we will have.
When you call from their births and the ministry.
And to and cheating. Like me, I do not always about me. It's uncomfortable for us, and sometimes it's uncomfortable for our friends because this issue knows no boundary. Expression is not just a fundamental right in itself. It also underpins good governance, public accountability, and respect for all human rights. Commonwealth Principles on Freedom of Expression and the Role of the Media, which was launched by the Commonwealth Association of Journalists at the heads of government meetings. It's the role of a free and independent media in holding those in power to account. This is why press freedom is so essential to democracy. Journalists are threatened, intimidated, or attacked. Hundreds are in detention, and in the first half of this year alone, 4 unacceptable. And the United Kingdom calls on all states to create an environment in which journalists can work in safety. Something that British ministers regularly raise with governments around the world. When our Foreign Secretary met Aung San Suu Kyi last week, journalists of Walloon and Chasu, and urged Burma to respect freedom of expression and rule of law. I raised Bangladesh and encouraged them to engage with civil society to address concerns over the information and communications technology. We've also asked the Egyptian authorities to release journalists and political detainees, to review mass judicial. This meeting, this body, the response of this audience to the families, volumes of this place to command collective action to do something about it. The United States and defend a free and independent media as an essential part of a secure and prosperous democratic world. Those that through our roles and sometimes through our families owe these brave people no less their freedom.
From Germany.
I'd like to commend you for being here today and giving your support. Supported all the UN General Assembly resolution. Media Security Council, and will be there in 2019 and 2020. We clear security will be a very important item, and we want to put that on the agenda. We said that. So we will have the legitimacy also to. On the speakers have said, Germany appeal to, and we also support, of course, the President Erdogan and her talk in Germany right now. Because they were not behind bars, because they did something similar. It was, and where the government didn't want this. We will. This rec peoples the criticism. The independence of or a press conference. This and.
I'm going to say some remarks, and I will start them. Talked to me a big. That was, but that was not. The worst part was on his have. and the computers to the art that this right was difficult. I knew this happening. It's part of our, and people are here. And in prison, right? Thank you so much.
Open up the floor to Q&A. Just identify yourself. In the back, yes.
And the news. First, Amal Clooney and Joel Simon in particular. After the sentencing, we mentioned like the New Yorker, ProPublica, Time Magazine make semi-official statements of solidarity. Wondering, is that best for them, or is that going to come back to bite them later? Will it be distorted? They're sort of going to subvert. What do
report to stop it anyway. They would in prison are heartened to know that they're getting this kind of response. Journalists
And maybe Steve, you want to work. They have a lot over many years. Is this kind the right thing to do for journalists and media organizations? And I think isolated and alone.
I think every place really does honor those. Really so passionate about this. So, I mean,
and then and report that this isn't just a case about two. In these cases is because they
he will say, and we, my colleagues are saying, I think it links.
Thank
you very much. My name is François Croquette. I'm the French ambassador for thank you for leave address the case of this journalist. As who we be Burma. For their release to Rakhine State. We also have launched France repeats its call for their release and for their fundamental rights to be respected, and of course for the media to be given free access to the Rakhine State. During this meeting, France co-hosted a ministerial meeting on Monday on Burma, during which their case was addressed. We also have launched an initiative for the protection of journalists worldwide, and I would like to recall that the French daily newspaper Le Monde has published the report of Walloon and Kwosu front page, and that the campaign in France for their release will continue until it has been achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite the U.S. Ambassador to ECOSOC, Elizabeth Curry, to make a brief intervention.
It's already, there we go. Thank you. First, I would love to thank Reuters and the Committee to Protect Journalists and the panelists for convening this important meeting today. On behalf of the U.S. mission to the United Nations and Ambassador Haley, I want to express our continued support for the release of Walloon and Josu. These two journalists were just doing their job, as has been amply stated today, and journalism is not a crime. Doing good journalism should never be a crime, and we stand in solidarity with them and their families and the other journalists who have been unjustly detained around the world. Ambassador Haley has spoken out very strongly on this case, both publicly